Most people believe they understand criminal profiling because they have seen it performed on screen, and that is precisely the problem. The popular image of the criminal profiler, that brooding, almost psychic investigator who walks into a crime scene and immediately begins channeling the mind of the killer, is one of the most persistent and misleading myths in all of law enforcement. Films like The Silence of the Lambs painted a portrait of profiling as an almost mystical exchange, a battle of wits between brilliant minds separated only by a pane of glass, where a single cryptic insight from a cannibalistic psychiatrist could crack an entire case wide open. Television series like Criminal Minds took this even further, presenting teams of profilers who could arrive at a crime scene, study a few photographs, and within the span of a single episode deliver a detailed description of the perpetrator down to his childhood trauma, his car, and his likely next move. And more recently, Mindhunter offered a grittier, more grounded portrayal of the FBI's early behavioral science work. And yet even that show, for all its careful attention to period detail and psychological nuance, ultimately compressed years of painstaking research into dramatic conversations and revelatory moments that unfolded with a narrative tidiness the real work never possessed. What all of these portrayals share, despite their varying degrees of sophistication, is a fundamental misrepresentation of what criminal profiling actually involves. They present it as an act of inspired intuition, a kind of dark empathy where the profiler slips inside the mind of the killer and sees the world through his eyes. The reality is at once far less cinematic and far more impressive. Real criminal profiling is not an art performed by gifted savants. It is a discipline built on behavioral science, statistical analysis, crime scene interpretation, victimology, forensic psychology, and the accumulated wisdom drawn from thousands of cases studied over decades. It is slow, it is methodical, it is often tedious, and it is grounded not in flashes of brilliance but in the careful, systematic study of human behavior at its most extreme. The real profilers who built this discipline were not brooding geniuses who operated on instinct. They were researchers, academics, and field agents who spent years, in some cases their entire careers, sitting across from the most dangerous human beings on the planet, asking careful questions, recording answers, looking for patterns, and slowly, painstakingly constructing frameworks that could help investigators narrow the field of suspects in cases that had gone cold or that defied conventional investigative approaches. They did not read minds, they read behavior. They studied what a crime scene revealed about the person who created it, understanding that every act of violence is also an act of communication, that the way a person commits a crime tells you something meaningful about who that person is, how they think, how they relate to the world, and what psychological needs the crime was designed to fulfill. This is the real story of criminal profiling. Not a tale of supernatural insight, but a story of scientific ambition, institutional resistance, psychological complexity, and the slow construction of a body of knowledge that has fundamentally changed the way law enforcement understands and investigates serial violence. And like all real stories, it begins not with a dramatic revelation, but with a quiet recognition that something was going terribly wrong, and that the existing tools were not sufficient to address it. By the late 1960s, the United States was experiencing a phenomenon that law enforcement had never confronted at this scale. The rate of stranger-on-stranger homicide was climbing steadily, and with it came a type of crime that local police departments were profoundly ill-equipped to investigate. Traditional homicide investigation rested on a simple and usually reliable assumption that the victim and the killer were connected: a spouse, a business partner, a neighbor, a rival. Find the connection and you find the killer. But the new wave of serial violence shattered that assumption entirely. Victims were being selected not because of who they were, but because of what they represented in the mind of the killer. They were targeted for their appearance, their vulnerability, their symbolic resonance with some internal fantasy the perpetrator had been nurturing for years or even decades. There was no prior relationship to trace, no financial motive to follow, no jealous rage to uncover. The kills were stranger crimes in the most complete sense of the term, and they left local investigators utterly bewildered. It was in this context that the Federal Bureau of Investigation established the Behavioral Science Unit at the FBI Academy in Quantico, Virginia, in 1972. The unit's original mandate was relatively modest: to provide instruction and training to FBI agents and visiting law enforcement professionals in areas related to criminal psychology, hostage negotiation, and applied behavioral science. It was, at its inception, more of a teaching shop than an investigative one, but two of its earliest members, Special Agent Howard Teeton and Special Agent Patrick Mullaney, recognised almost immediately that the unit's position at the intersection of psychology and law enforcement gave it a unique opportunity to do something that no one else in the Bureau was doing, to study violent criminal behaviour not merely as evidence in a case but as data that could be analysed, categorised and used predictively. Teeton, who had been developing his own informal approach to crime scene analysis since the 1960s, had been quietly offering what he called criminal profiling assistance to local police departments for years before the BSU was formally established. His method was intuitive but grounded in a careful reading of crime scene evidence. He would examine the physical details of a scene, the nature of the violence, the positioning of the body, the presence or absence of certain behaviours like staging, overkill or post-mortem interaction, and from those details he would construct a hypothetical portrait of the offender. Mullaney, who had a background in psychology, brought a more formal theoretical framework to the effort, drawing on clinical research into personality disorders, psychopathology, and deviant behaviour. Together they began developing what would become the intellectual foundation of criminal profiling as a systematic discipline, one that treated the crime scene as a behavioural mirror reflecting the psychological characteristics of the person who created it. But it was the arrival of two younger agents in the mid to late 1970s that truly transformed the behavioural science unit from a training program into what would become the most influential centre for the study of serial violence in the world. Robert Ressler, who joined the BSU in 1974, and John Douglas, who joined in 1977, shared a conviction that the key to understanding serial offenders lay not in academic theory alone, but in direct contact with the offenders themselves. Ressler, a former Army criminal investigator with a deep interest in abnormal psychology, had long believed that the criminal justice system was failing to exploit a vast and largely untapped resource. The imprisoned serial killers and sexual murderers already sitting in penitentiaries across the country, many of them willing and even eager to talk about their crimes in detail. Douglas, who was younger and had a natural gift for rapport building and interrogation, proved to be an ideal partner for the kind of intensive interviewing Ressler had in mind. Beginning in 1978, the two agents launched what would become one of the most important research projects in the history of criminal justice. The concept was deceptively simple. Ressler and Douglas, sometimes working together and sometimes separately, would visit federal and state prisons across the country, sit down with convicted serial killers and serial rapists, and conduct lengthy, detailed interviews designed to explore every aspect of the offender's life: childhood, family dynamics, education, sexual development, fantasy life, the progression from thought to action, the planning and execution of their crimes, and their behaviour in the aftermath. They spoke with 36 convicted sexual murderers over a period of several years, including some of the most notorious names in American criminal history. They sat across from Edmund Kemper, the so-called co-ed killer, a 6'9" former mental patient who had murdered his grandparents as a teenager, and then, after being released from a psychiatric facility, had killed 6 female hitchhikers, his own mother, and his mother's best friend in the Santa Cruz area of California in the early 1970s. Kemper proved to be one of the most valuable and most unsettling interview subjects in the entire project. He was articulate, intelligent, possessed of a measured and almost clinical ability to describe his own crimes and the psychological processes that drove them, and he was chillingly cooperative. Where some subjects were evasive, hostile, or performative, Kemper spoke with a detached precision that allowed Ressler and Douglas to map the internal landscape of a serial killer's mind with a level of detail they had rarely encountered. He described the evolution of his violent fantasies, the way he selected and approached his victims, the rituals he performed during and after the killings, and the psychological gratification he derived from each stage of the process. He was not boasting, he was explaining, and the distinction for researchers trying to build a scientific framework for understanding serial violence was invaluable. They also interviewed Monte Rissel, Jerome Brudos, Richard Chase, and dozens of others, each conversation adding new data points to an emerging picture of how serial offenders thought, planned, acted, and adapted. The interviews were not casual conversations. Ressler and Douglas developed a structured interview protocol that covered dozens of specific topics, from birth order and parental discipline to the age of first violent fantasy, the role of pornography in fantasy development, the offender's awareness of media coverage of his crimes, and his emotional state before, during, and after each offence. The goal was not simply to understand individual killers, but to identify patterns, recurring behavioural and psychological characteristics that could be used to classify offenders into meaningful categories, and, from those categories, to make predictions about the likely characteristics of unknown offenders based on the evidence they left behind. What emerged from this monumental effort was the first empirically grounded typology of serial sexual murderers, a classification system that would become the foundational framework of criminal profiling for the next 2 decades, and that, despite its limitations and subsequent revisions, remains one of the most influential contributions to the field. The framework divided offenders into 2 broad categories: organised and disorganized, based on the degree of planning, control, and behavioural sophistication evident in their crimes. The organised offender, as defined by the BSU research, is a killer who plans his crimes with deliberation and forethought. He selects his victims carefully, often targeting strangers who match a specific physical type or symbolic profile. He brings his own weapons and restraints to the crime scene rather than relying on whatever is available. He maintains control over the victim throughout the encounter, often through verbal manipulation, threats, or the use of restraints, and he derives psychological satisfaction from the exercise of that control. After the crime, the organised offender takes steps to conceal evidence, cleaning the scene, disposing of the body in a location separate from where the killing occurred, removing or destroying items that might link him to the crime. His crimes reflect a mind that is capable of sequential thinking, impulse control, and strategic planning. And critically, the BSU research found that these behavioural characteristics at the crime scene corresponded to identifiable personality traits and life circumstances. The organised offender was likely to be of average or above average intelligence, socially competent, employed, possibly in a skilled occupation, likely in a relationship or marriage, and able to present a convincingly normal facade to the outside world. He followed media coverage of his crimes. He was geographically mobile, often travelling significant distances to offend and to dispose of evidence. He was, in the language of clinical psychology, likely to meet the criteria for antisocial personality disorder with pronounced psychopathic traits, a person capable of mimicking emotional connection without actually experiencing it, who could compartmentalise his violent behaviour so thoroughly that the people closest to him might never suspect what he was capable of. The disorganised offender presented a starkly different picture, both at the crime scene and in his personal life. His crimes were impulsive, often triggered by a sudden psychological stressor or an escalation in an ongoing psychotic process. He did not plan. He did not bring weapons. He used whatever was at hand, a rock, a kitchen knife, his own hands. He typically offended close to home, often within walking distance, because he lacked the social competence and practical resources to range farther. His crime scenes were chaotic, marked by extreme and often bizarre violence, with evidence left in plain sight. He made little or no effort to conceal the body or clean up after himself. The crime scene often showed signs of disarray that went beyond the violence itself. Scattered belongings, open drawers, items moved or rearranged in ways that suggested confusion rather than searching. There was frequently evidence of post-mortem activity, continued interaction with the body after death, sometimes involving mutilation, posing, or other behaviours that reflected the offender's disordered mental state rather than any rational purpose. The disorganised offender, the BSU research suggested, was likely to be of below-average intelligence, socially isolated, unemployed, or employed only in menial work, living alone or with a parent, and suffering from significant mental illness, most commonly some form of psychotic disorder such as schizophrenia. He was unlikely to follow media coverage of his crimes, and might not even fully understand the significance of what he had done. He lived in close proximity to the crime scene, and often had some prior connection to the area, if not to the victim specifically. His personal living space, if investigators could locate and search it, would likely be as disordered as his crime scenes, unkempt, dirty, and potentially containing evidence of the crimes in plain view, because the disorganised offender lacked the cognitive capacity or the psychological motivation to conceal what he had done. The BSU researchers also acknowledged that many real-world cases did not fit neatly into one category or the other. Some offenders displayed a mixture of organised and disorganised characteristics, either because they fell somewhere along the spectrum between the two poles, or because situational factors, intoxication, interruption, escalating panic, caused an otherwise organized offender to behave in disorganized ways, or because a disorganized offender had a period of relative lucidity that allowed for more planning than his baseline psychology would suggest. This mixed category was always understood to be part of the framework, a recognition that human behavior resists rigid classification, and that the organized-disorganized typology was a tool for generating investigative hypotheses rather than a diagnostic manual for definitively categorizing offenders. The value of the framework lay not in its precision, but in its ability to help investigators reason backward from crime scene evidence to offender characteristics, narrowing the universe of potential suspects from the entire population of a city or region down to a much smaller subset defined by specific behavioral and demographic parameters. And nowhere was the power of this framework more dramatically demonstrated than in two cases from the same era that represented opposite poles of the organized-disorganized spectrum, and that together illustrated both the explanatory power and the practical utility of the BSU's approach to criminal profiling. Richard Trenton Chase, who would come to be known in the press as the Sacramento Vampire and the Dracula Killer, was born in 1950 and grew up in Sacramento, California, in a household marked by parental conflict, emotional instability, and what would later be recognized as early signs of severe psychological disturbance. As a child, Chase exhibited the triad of behaviors that would later become associated in the profiling literature with the development of violent psychopathology: bedwetting, fire setting, and cruelty to animals, though in Chase's case the animal cruelty took forms so extreme that they went well beyond what even the darkest clinical literature typically describes. By his teenage years, Chase was already showing signs of the paranoid schizophrenia that would come to dominate and ultimately destroy his life. He became convinced that his heart was shrinking, that his blood was being poisoned, that the bones in his skull were separating, and that his brain was exposed. He believed that he needed to consume blood, first animal blood, then human blood, in order to prevent his body from disintegrating. He was hospitalized multiple times in psychiatric facilities throughout his 20s, and on at least one occasion hospital staff found him with bird blood smeared around his mouth, having captured and killed birds that landed on his window ledge. Despite these clear and escalating warning signs, Chase was released from institutional care in 1977 and returned to Sacramento, where he was placed in an apartment by his mother, who gave him a monthly stipend and largely left him to his own devices. He lived alone. He had no friends, no job, no social connections of any meaningful kind. His apartment quickly became a reflection of his deteriorating psyche, filthy, cluttered with animal remains, stained with blood, and containing a blender he used to liquefy the organs of animals he killed and consumed. In January of 1978, Chase began killing human beings, and the crime scenes he left behind would become textbook illustrations of the disorganized offender profile in every detail. His first victim was an engineer named Ambrose Griffin, shot at random while carrying groceries into his home. There was no connection between Chase and Griffin. There was no apparent motive. There was no planning. Chase had simply been driving through the neighborhood with a firearm he legally owned and had fired at a stranger. Over the next month, Chase killed 5 more people in a series of attacks that escalated rapidly in both violence and bizarre ritualistic behavior. He entered homes that were unlocked, not because he had scouted them or planned his entry, but because in his disordered thinking an unlocked door was an invitation, while a locked door meant he was not welcome, and he would simply move on to the next house. He attacked whoever he found inside, regardless of age or gender, using whatever frenzied combination of shooting, stabbing, and manual violence the moment seemed to demand. His crime scenes were nightmarish in their disarray. Blood was smeared on walls, on floors, on household objects. Organs were removed from victims and in some cases were found in the kitchen, where Chase had attempted to consume them. A baby's body was found mutilated. In one home, investigators discovered a yogurt container filled with blood and human brain tissue in the refrigerator. Nothing was cleaned, nothing was concealed. Fingerprints, footprints, and physical evidence were left at every scene with an almost incomprehensible carelessness. When FBI profilers were consulted on the case, they examined the crime scenes and produced a profile that read like a clinical description of the disorganized offender archetype. They told Sacramento police that they were looking for a white male in his mid-20s to early 30s, thin and undernourished in appearance, living alone within a mile of the crime scenes, probably in a residence that would show extreme neglect and disarray. They predicted he would be unemployed, socially isolated, with a history of mental illness and possibly prior institutionalization. They said he would not own a car in good condition and would likely travel on foot or in a vehicle that was visibly deteriorated. They predicted that evidence of the crimes would be found in his residence in plain sight, because he lacked both the capacity and the motivation to conceal what he had done, and they predicted that his mental state would be visibly deteriorating, that people who encountered him would notice bizarre behaviour, unkempt appearance, and signs of psychological disturbance that would be impossible to miss. Every element of this profile proved accurate when Richard Chase was identified and apprehended. A woman who had attended high school with Chase recognised a police sketch and provided his name. When investigators located his apartment, they found exactly what the profilers had predicted: a residence of almost indescribable squalor, with blood-stained clothing, animal remains, a collection of newspaper clippings about the crimes, and physical evidence linking Chase to every one of the murders. He was living within a mile of the crime scenes. He was thin, dishevelled, unemployed, alone, and visibly disturbed. His car was in such poor condition that neighbours had reported it. The profile had not merely pointed investigators in the right direction. It had described Chase so precisely that it almost read as a biographical sketch written by someone who knew him. The case became a landmark illustration of the disorganized offender concept, and a powerful demonstration that crime scene behaviour could, when properly interpreted, reveal meaningful and actionable information about the person who committed the crime. The psychological mechanism underlying Chase's behaviour was tragically clear to anyone trained in the recognition of psychotic processes. His kills were driven not by the kind of sexual sadism or power-seeking that motivates many serial offenders, but by a delusional belief system that told him he would literally die if he did not consume human blood and organs. There was no fantasy of domination, no pleasure in the victim's suffering, no carefully cultivated ritual of control. There was only chaos, desperation, and the terrible logic of a mind that had lost contact with reality so completely that murder seemed not merely justified, but necessary for survival. His crime scenes reflected this internal state with an almost perfect fidelity. Disordered, frenzied, purposeless in their violence, marked by behaviours that served the offender's delusional needs rather than any recognisable criminal objective. And because his psychosis robbed him of the capacity for planning, concealment and strategic thinking, he left behind a trail of evidence so abundant that, once investigators knew where to look, the case essentially solved itself. If Richard Chase represented one extreme of the behavioural spectrum, Theodore Robert Bundy represented the other with equal clarity and far greater sophistication. Born in 1946 in Burlington, Vermont, Bundy grew up in circumstances that were troubled but that, on the surface, bore little resemblance to the overt dysfunction and institutional involvement that characterized Chase's background. Bundy was intelligent, articulate, and socially skilled in ways that Chase could never have been. He attended the University of Washington, studied psychology, worked on political campaigns, volunteered at a crisis hotline, attended law school, and maintained romantic relationships with women who described him as charming, attentive, and emotionally engaged. He was, by every external measure, a functioning and even promising young man, and this was precisely what made him so dangerous and so important to the developing science of criminal profiling. Bundy's killing career, which spanned at least 4 years and may have begun earlier than the confirmed cases suggest, was a masterclass in organised criminal behaviour. He planned his abductions with meticulous care, often visiting potential hunting grounds in advance, studying the patterns of foot traffic, identifying the most vulnerable targets and the safest approach and escape routes. He selected victims who shared a remarkably consistent physical profile: young women, typically college-aged, with long dark hair parted in the middle, a pattern that numerous researchers have linked to Bundy's fixation on a former girlfriend who had ended their relationship and whose rejection Bundy experienced as a profound narcissistic wound. His method of approach was sophisticated and psychologically manipulative. He frequently employed a ruse to lower his victims' defences. The arm sling was his most famous technique, wearing a fake cast or sling and asking young women to help him carry books or load something into his car, exploiting their compassion and their culturally conditioned willingness to help a person who appeared injured and non-threatening. He also posed as authority figures, including police officers, and used his natural charm and conventional good looks to establish enough trust in a brief encounter that his victims would voluntarily accompany him to his vehicle. Once he had control of a victim, Bundy transported them to remote locations he had previously identified, locations chosen specifically because they offered privacy and reduced the risk of detection. He brought his own ligatures, tools, and materials. He maintained control throughout the assault through physical restraint and psychological domination, and after the killing, he disposed of bodies in locations far from the abduction sites, sometimes returning to the dump sites days or weeks later for post-mortem interaction, a behaviour that revealed the necrophilic dimension of his paraphilia and the degree to which his crimes were driven by elaborate fantasies of possession and control that did not end with the victim's death. His crime scenes, or rather, his abduction sites, since Bundy was careful to separate the location where he acquired victims from the locations where he killed and disposed of them, were notable for what they did not contain. There was almost no physical evidence left behind. Witnesses could rarely provide useful descriptions because the encounters had been so brief and so normal-seeming that the victim simply vanished without anyone registering alarm until it was far too late. His geographic mobility was extraordinary. He killed in Washington, Oregon, Utah, Colorado, and Florida, crossing state lines with a frequency that exploited the fragmented nature of American law enforcement, where crimes in different jurisdictions were investigated by different agencies that often had no systematic way of sharing information or recognizing that the cases were connected. This geographic dispersion also reflected the organized offender's capacity for strategic thinking. Bundy understood, whether consciously or intuitively, that distance was his ally, that every mile between crime scenes reduced the probability that a pattern would be detected. When he was finally captured, first in Utah in 1975 through a combination of a traffic stop and a surviving victim's identification, and then definitively in Florida in 1978 after escaping custody twice and committing further murders, the details of his life confirmed the organized offender profile with remarkable precision. He was intelligent, with a tested IQ in the superior range. He was educated, employed, and socially connected. He maintained relationships and friendships with people who were genuinely shocked by his arrest, because nothing in his observable behaviour had suggested what he was capable of. He followed media coverage of his crimes obsessively. He was fascinated by the investigative process and took active steps to evade detection, including washing his car compulsively, changing his appearance, and altering his methods when he believed police were getting close to identifying his pattern. He was, in clinical terms, a textbook case of antisocial personality disorder with pronounced psychopathic features, superficially charming, emotionally shallow, incapable of genuine empathy or remorse, grandiose in his self-perception, and possessed of a compartmentalization so thorough that he could strangle a young woman to death and then attend a law school lecture the next morning without a visible tremor. And yet, for all that Bundy represented as a case study in the organized offender, his capture and the subsequent interviews conducted by the BSU opened a window into something far more fundamental than classification, something that would reshape the unit's understanding of how serial killers are made rather than merely how they behave once made, and that something was the role of fantasy, the private interior theatre of the mind where violence is rehearsed and refined long before it ever touches the physical world. The research that Ressler, Douglas, and their colleagues conducted through dozens of prison interviews revealed a pattern so consistent that it approached the level of a psychological law. Virtually every serial offender they spoke with described a rich, elaborate, and escalating fantasy life that preceded their first criminal act by years, and in many cases by decades. A fantasy life that had begun not with thoughts of murder, but with a diffuse sense of powerlessness, of being acted upon by a world that offered neither comfort nor control, and that had gradually, almost organically, evolved into increasingly specific scenarios of dominance, possession, and ultimately destruction. The seeds of these fantasies could almost always be traced to experiences in childhood or adolescence, experiences that in isolation might seem unremarkable, or at least not uncommon, a humiliation at the hands of a parent or peer, a moment of sexual confusion or shame, a period of profound isolation during which the developing mind turned inward and began to construct an alternative reality where the child was not the victim but the architect, not the powerless but the all-powerful. What distinguished the future serial offender from the millions of other children who experienced similar moments of pain and confusion was not necessarily the severity of the original wound, but the depth and persistence of the fantasy response, the degree to which the child retreated into this interior world, and the degree to which that world began to take on a life of its own, growing more vivid, more detailed, more consuming with each passing year. In the early stages, the fantasies were often passive, almost cinematic in quality, the child watching scenes of power and control unfold in the mind's eye, as though projected on a screen. But over time they became participatory, the child inserting himself into the narrative as the central actor, the one who decides, the one who controls, the one whose will cannot be resisted or denied. The BSU researchers identified what they came to call a tipping point, though they understood that this term oversimplified what was in reality a gradual erosion rather than a sudden collapse. The moment, or more accurately, the period during which fantasy alone could no longer contain the psychological pressure that had been building for years, when the gap between the interior world of total control and the exterior world of perceived helplessness became so intolerable that the offender felt compelled to bridge it through action, to make the fantasy real, to test whether the world would yield to his will the way the figures in his imagination had always yielded. This first offence was almost never as satisfying as the fantasy had promised it would be, a fact that the offenders themselves reported with surprising consistency, describing their first crimes in terms that suggested disappointment, confusion, even a kind of bewildered anticlimax, and yet rather than extinguishing the compulsion, this disappointment intensified it, because the offender now believed that the fantasy could be perfected, that the next time he could get it right, could make reality conform more precisely to the script he had been writing in his mind for so many years, and so each subsequent offence became an attempt to close the gap between fantasy and reality, each one bringing him incrementally closer to the scenario he had rehearsed thousands of times in the privacy of his own imagination, and each relative success reinforcing the fantasy and making the next offence not only more likely but more urgent, creating a feedback loop that the BSU researchers recognised as the central engine of serial violence. Contributing to this cycle were factors that the researchers came to understand as inhibition reducers, elements that lowered the psychological barriers between thought and action, and chief among these were pornography, particularly violent or degrading pornography, that served to normalise the content of the offender's fantasies and to provide new material for elaboration, alcohol and drugs that dulled the already weakened moral restraints and reduced the offender's capacity for self-regulation, and media consumption that presented violence in aestheticized or consequence-free terms, not as causes of the violence in any simple deterministic sense, but as accelerants, as substances thrown onto a fire that was already burning. The fantasy itself, the researchers noted, became more elaborate and more specific over time, evolving from vague scenarios of power into detailed operational plans that specified the type of victim, the method of approach, the location, the sequence of acts to be performed, the tools to be used, creating what amounted to a rehearsal script for future offences, so that by the time the offender actually committed his crimes, he had already committed them hundreds or thousands of times in his imagination. And this was why certain serial offenders could execute complex and dangerous acts with a calm efficiency that seemed almost practiced, because in a very real sense it was practiced, rehearsed in the one theatre to which no investigator had access, the theatre of the offender's own mind, and it was this insight, perhaps more than any other, that convinced the BSU that understanding the fantasy was the key to understanding the crime, that the physical evidence left at a scene was in many ways a translation of the fantasy into the language of action, and that learning to read that translation backward, from action to fantasy, from crime scene to psychology, was the essential skill of the criminal profiler. This growing body of knowledge, accumulated through years of interviews and case analysis, and refined through the hard experience of active investigations, eventually reached a critical mass that demanded formal organisation, and the result was one of the most ambitious undertakings in the history of criminal justice, a project that would occupy the better part of a decade and that would attempt to do for violent crime what the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders had done for mental illness, which is to say, to create a standardized classification system, a common language, a shared framework through which investigators, prosecutors, and researchers across different jurisdictions and different disciplines could discuss and categorize criminal behavior with precision and consistency, This project culminated in 1992 with the publication of the Crime Classification Manual, authored by John Douglas, Robert Ressler, and the research team of Anne Burgess and Alan Burgess. A work that represented the distillation of everything the BSU had learned over nearly 2 decades of systematic study, and that organised the sprawling landscape of violent criminal behaviour into a taxonomy as rigorous and as carefully considered as any scientific classification system. The manual identified 4 major categories of crime: homicide, arson, sexual assault, and a broader category of non-violent crimes, and within each of these categories it established subcategories organised not by the surface characteristics of the crime, but by the underlying motivation that drove the offender, because the BSU's research had demonstrated conclusively that the same type of criminal act could arise from fundamentally different psychological sources, and that understanding the motivation was essential to understanding the offender. These motivational subcategories included criminal enterprise, in which the crime was committed as a means to a tangible end such as financial gain, or the elimination of a witness; personal cause, in which the crime arose from an emotional conflict specific to the offender's relationship with the victim or with the world at large; sexual motivation, in which the crime was driven by the offender's deviant sexual needs and fantasies; and group cause, in which the crime was committed in service of an ideology or group dynamic that transcended the individual offender's personal psychology. Each subcategory was further refined with detailed descriptions of typical crime scene characteristics, victimology patterns, and offender traits, creating a multi-layered system that an investigator could use to move from the observable facts of a crime scene to a probabilistic profile of the person who committed it. And while the manual did not claim to offer certainty, it offered something that had not existed before, which was a structured and evidence-based method for translating physical evidence into behavioral inference. The Crime Classification Manual gave investigators across the country, and eventually across the world, a common vocabulary for discussing violent crime, so that a detective in Oregon and a detective in Florida could describe a case using the same terms and the same categories, and could immediately understand the implications of those terms for the type of offender they were likely seeking. And this shared language proved invaluable in an era when serial offenders frequently crossed jurisdictional boundaries, and when the lack of communication between law enforcement agencies had historically been one of the greatest obstacles to their apprehension. The manual was not without its critics, of course, and the criticisms were not trivial. Some researchers argued that the classification system was too rigid, that it imposed artificial boundaries on behaviour that existed along a continuum. Others questioned the empirical foundation of the categories, noting that they were derived primarily from interviews with incarcerated offenders whose self-reports might be unreliable or self-serving, and still others worried that the manual could create a false sense of certainty, encouraging investigators to fit cases into predetermined categories rather than following the evidence wherever it led. And these were legitimate concerns that the authors themselves acknowledged, understanding that any classification system is a simplification of reality, and that the map, however useful, must never be confused with the territory. Yet alongside the Crime Classification Manual, the BSU was also developing other tools that approach criminal investigation from entirely different angles, and among the most subtle and the most psychologically demanding of these was the technique that came to be known as the psychological autopsy, a method that had its origins not in the study of killers but in the study of the dead, specifically in those troubling cases where the manner of death was genuinely uncertain, where the evidence at the scene could support multiple interpretations, where it was not clear whether the deceased had taken their own life, been killed by another, or died through some terrible accident, cases that investigators referred to as equivocal deaths, and that represented some of the most challenging puzzles in all of forensic investigation. The psychological autopsy, as refined by the BSU and its affiliated researchers, was an attempt to reconstruct the inner life of the deceased in the days, weeks, and months preceding death, to build a portrait of their psychological state so detailed and so intimate that the manner of death could be inferred from the trajectory of the life. And this reconstruction was achieved through an exhaustive process of information gathering that went far beyond the physical evidence at the scene. Profilers conducting a psychological autopsy would interview the deceased's family members, friends, romantic partners, colleagues, neighbours, and anyone else who had observed their behaviour in the period leading up to death, asking not only about what the person did but about how they seemed, whether their mood had changed, whether they had expressed hopelessness or fear, whether they had given away possessions or made unusual arrangements, whether they had spoken about death or about the future, and from these interviews a picture would emerge, sometimes clear and sometimes maddeningly ambiguous, of a person moving toward or away from the act of self-destruction. They would examine the deceased's journals and correspondence, their medical records and prescription history, looking for evidence of depression, anxiety, chronic pain, or the use of medications that might alter mood or judgment. They would scrutinize financial records for signs of mounting debt, or sudden large expenditures that might suggest either desperation or the careless spending of someone who no longer expected to need money. They would review employment records for evidence of recent termination or conflict, and they would examine the person's social media and electronic communications for any indication of their state of mind in those final days and hours. In one notable case that became a teaching example within the BSU, a middle-aged businessman was found dead in his home office, with a single gunshot wound to the head and a handgun lying on the floor beside the chair, and the initial investigation treated the death as a probable suicide. But certain elements of the scene troubled the local investigators, and a psychological autopsy was requested. And through weeks of interviews and records analysis, the profilers constructed a portrait of a man who, far from being suicidal, had been energetically planning a new business venture, had recently begun a romantic relationship that friends described as the happiest he had been in years, had made a series of long-term financial investments in the days before his death, and had purchased non-refundable airline tickets for a vacation 3 months in the future. And this portrait, combined with a re-examination of the physical evidence that revealed subtle inconsistencies with a self-inflicted wound, led to the reclassification of the death as a homicide, and ultimately to the identification and conviction of the person responsible. The technique of the psychological autopsy also proved adaptable in ways that its originators had not initially anticipated, because the same skills and methods that were used to reconstruct the psychological life of the dead could be applied to understanding the living, specifically to understanding serial offenders through the lens of their victims, and this application connected the psychological autopsy directly to the broader discipline of victimology that the BSU had been developing since its earliest days, by deeply and painstakingly reconstructing the last movements of a victim, by understanding where they went and why, who they spoke to and what they said, what choices they made and what those choices revealed about their personality, their habits, their vulnerabilities. The profilers could work backward to the moment of intersection between victim and offender, and could infer from the nature of that intersection something essential about the offender himself, how he selected his victims, how he approached them, what he said or did to gain their trust or to overcome their resistance, and these inferences became part of what later practitioners would call behavioral evidence analysis, a systematic method for reading the story of a crime not only from the evidence left by the offender, but from the evidence left by the victim, the two narratives intertwining like threads in a rope, each one incomplete without the other. The psychological autopsy thus represented a philosophical commitment as much as a practical technique, a commitment to the idea that the dead still had something to tell the living, that every life contained within it a record of its own ending if only one knew how to read it, and this commitment would prove its value again and again in the years to come, in cases where the difference between suicide and murder, between accident and intent, between one killer and another, hung on the finest threads of behavioral evidence, threads that could only be seen by those who'd been trained to look for them with patience, with rigor, and with the kind of deep human attention that no technology could replicate. The contrast between Bundy and Chase, two killers operating in the same state during roughly the same period, could hardly have been more stark, and it was precisely this contrast that gave the organized-disorganized framework its explanatory power. Here were two men who had both committed serial murder, and yet virtually everything about their crimes, the planning, the victim selection, the crime scene behavior, the evidence disposition, the geographic patterns, was different. And those differences at the crime scene corresponded with remarkable consistency to differences in their personal lives, their psychological functioning, their intelligence, their social competence, and their mental health. Chase was psychotic, isolated, and incapable of the most basic social and practical functioning. Bundy was psychopathic, integrated, and capable of presenting a seamless mask of normalcy to the world. Their crime scenes told investigators which type of person they were looking for, and in both cases the profile proved accurate in ways that meaningfully advanced the investigation. Bundy's case also illustrated something that the BSU researchers were beginning to understand with increasing clarity, that the organized offender, precisely because of his social competence and his capacity for concealment, was far more difficult to catch than his disorganized counterpart, and that traditional investigative methods, which relied on physical evidence and witness testimony, were often insufficient for these cases. It was the behavioral analysis, the recognition that the crime scenes showed a pattern of deliberate control and planning, that the victim selection followed a consistent template, that the geographic distribution suggested a mobile offender with resources and intelligence, that allowed investigators to begin constructing a picture of who they were looking for, even when the physical evidence was scant. And it was the eventual confirmation of that behavioral picture, when Bundy was identified and his life circumstances matched the profile predictions, that gave the profiling community confidence that their framework was capturing something real about the relationship between crime scene behavior and offender psychology. What these two cases demonstrated, individually and in their striking juxtaposition, was that the crime scene is not merely a repository of physical evidence, but a behavioral document, a record of decisions made under extreme psychological pressure that reveals the decision-maker's cognitive style, emotional state, level of planning, relationship to reality, and underlying motivational structure. And what the profilers at the Behavioral Science Unit learned from studying hundreds of these cases, from sitting across from dozens of convicted killers in prison interview rooms, and from consulting on active investigations across the country, led them to develop increasingly sophisticated analytical frameworks that moved well beyond the simple organized-disorganized dichotomy toward more nuanced models of criminal behavior, models that accounted for the complex interplay of fantasy, escalation, situational variables, and the unique psychological signature that each offender brings to what those early pioneers discovered as they sat across from incarcerated killers in dimly lit prison interview rooms and pored over thousands of case files in the BSU's basement offices at Quantico, was that the victim was never random, never truly arbitrary, even when the killing appeared senseless to outside observers. The study of victimology became one of the most powerful tools in the profiler's analytical arsenal, a discipline built on a deceptively simple premise, that by understanding who was chosen, one could begin to understand who was doing the choosing. Every victim told a story not just about their own life and the tragedy of its ending, but about the mind that had selected them, stalked them, and ultimately decided that they, out of all the people moving through the world on any given day, would be the one who would not come home. Profilers learned to ask a very specific set of questions when examining victim selection patterns, questions that went far beyond the obvious demographics of age, gender, and race, though those were certainly part of the equation. They wanted to know about the victim's lifestyle, their daily routines, the places they frequented, the level of risk inherent in their day-to-day existence. This led to the development of what became known as the risk continuum, a scale that classified victims according to how vulnerable their lifestyle made them to violent predation. A high-risk victim was someone whose circumstances placed them in frequent contact with potential offenders, someone who might work in the sex trade, struggle with addiction, live transiently, or regularly find themselves in isolated or dangerous environments during the hours when predators were most active. A low-risk victim, by contrast, was someone whose lifestyle was stable, predictable, and insulated from routine exposure to criminal elements. A suburban mother who followed the same route to work every day, a college student who lived on campus and socialized within a defined peer group, a child who played in a supervised neighborhood. The distinction mattered enormously to profilers because the risk level of the victim said something profound about the capability and confidence of the offender. A killer who could successfully abduct a low-risk victim, someone who would be immediately missed, someone who was cautious and situated within a web of social connections, had to be significantly more sophisticated than one who targeted high-risk individuals whose disappearance might go unnoticed for days or even weeks. The abduction of a low-risk victim required planning, social skill, the ability to approach without raising alarm, a vehicle, a ruse, a plausible pretext for initiating contact. It suggested an organized offender, someone who could present a trustworthy facade, someone who likely held down employment and maintained at least a surface-level appearance of normalcy. Conversely, a pattern of high-risk victims, while no less devastating in human terms, often pointed to a less socially competent offender, someone who lacked the interpersonal skills to lure a cautious target, someone who hunted in environments where vulnerability was already present, where transactions were quick, and trust was extended out of necessity rather than genuine rapport. The approach method itself became a rich source of behavioral data. Profilers categorized offender approaches into three primary types: the con approach, in which the killer used a ruse or manipulation to gain the victim's trust before revealing hostile intent; the blitz approach, in which sudden overwhelming force was used with no attempt at social interaction; and the surprise approach, in which the killer lay in wait, ambushing the victim in a location where they felt safe. Each approach type correlated with different personality characteristics and levels of social functioning. A con artist was typically verbally skilled, often charming, capable of reading social cues and exploiting them, traits associated with organized offenders and in many cases with psychopathic personality structures. A blitz attacker, by contrast, might lack the verbal facility to sustain even a brief deceptive interaction, suggesting social deficits, possible intellectual limitations, or a level of rage so consuming that it precluded the patience required for manipulation. Beyond these categorical assessments, profilers discovered something even more revealing in the study of victim selection: the concept of the ideal victim type. Serial offenders, particularly those driven by sexual or power-oriented motivations, almost always had a specific template for their preferred victim, a constellation of physical and demographic characteristics that triggered their predatory response. This template was not arbitrary. It was rooted deep in the offender's psychological history, often connected to early experiences of desire, humiliation, or trauma. A killer might target women of a certain age range who wore their hair in a particular style, or young men with a specific physical build, or children within a narrow age window. The specificity varied, but the pattern was almost always present when enough cases were examined. Robert Ressler and John Douglas found that when they pressed incarcerated killers about why they chose the victims they did, many struggled to articulate a clear reason, yet the demographic consistency across their victim pools was unmistakable. Some killers acknowledged that certain individuals simply triggered something in them, a compulsion that overrode rational thought, a feeling that this person was right in some way they could not fully explain. For profilers, the victim template became a kind of photographic negative of the killer's inner world, an inverse image that, when examined carefully, revealed the outlines of the psychology producing it. A killer who targeted victims resembling a maternal figure might be working through unresolved rage toward his own mother. One who chose victims from a specific socio-economic stratum might be expressing class-based resentment or a desire to destroy what he could not possess. The victim was, in a very real sense, a mirror, and what profilers learned to see in that mirror was not the victim's story, but the killer's. This understanding of victimology fed directly into the broader analytical framework that profilers were developing for reading crime scenes, because the crime scene was where the killer's internal world became externalized, where fantasy became action, and where every choice the offender made left behind a psychological trace as surely as a fingerprint left behind a physical one. The way profilers learn to read crime scenes has often been compared to the way an art critic reads a painting, and the analogy is more apt than it might initially seem. Just as a trained eye can look at a canvas and discern not only what the artist intended to depict, but also their emotional state, their level of skill, their influences, and even their personality, a trained profiler could walk through a crime scene and begin to construct a portrait of the mind that had created it. Every element of the scene carried potential meaning, from the macro to the micro, from the overall spatial organization of the environment to the precise positioning of the victim's body. One of the first distinctions profilers learned to make was between staging and posing, two behaviors that might look similar to an untrained observer, but that carried very different psychological implications. Staging referred to the deliberate alteration of a crime scene to mislead investigators about the true nature of the crime. A killer who staged a scene might make a deliberate targeted murder look like a burglary gone wrong, scattering belongings, breaking a window from the outside, removing valuables to create the appearance of theft motivation. Staging was a rational, instrumental behavior, a sign of an organized mind that was thinking about consequences and attempting to direct the investigation away from the true motive. It almost always indicated that the killer had a connection to the victim that could be discovered, because a stranger with no linkable relationship would have little reason to disguise the nature of the crime. Posing, by contrast, was something altogether different and far more psychologically revealing. Posing referred to the deliberate arrangement of the victim's body in a way that served no practical investigative purpose but fulfilled a psychological need in the offender. A posed victim might be left in a degrading position, arranged to face a particular direction, displayed with symbolic objects placed on or near the body, or positioned in a way that communicated a message, whether to the investigators, to the public, or to some audience that existed only in the killer's mind. Posing was signature behavior, an expression of the killer's fantasy, and it told profilers that the offender was deriving psychological satisfaction not merely from the act of killing, but from the tableau he created afterward, from the scene as a form of communication or artistic expression, however grotesque. Equally significant was the phenomenon of overkill, the infliction of damage far exceeding what was necessary to cause death. When profilers encountered a victim with dozens of stab wounds, or whose face had been beaten beyond recognition, or whose body showed evidence of prolonged assault continuing well after the point of death, they recognized this as a behavioral indicator of intense personal emotion. Overkill suggested rage, and rage of that magnitude typically pointed to a relationship between offender and victim, or at the very least to a victim who symbolized someone significant in the offender's emotional life. The face, in particular, was a critical focal point. Depersonalization of the victim, the deliberate destruction of facial features, often indicated that the killer knew the victim and could not bear to look at them during or after the act, or alternatively, that the face represented something the killer needed to obliterate, an identity that triggered overwhelming emotional conflict. Trophy-taking and souvenir collecting added yet another layer to the crime scene analysis. Profilers distinguished between trophies, which were items taken from the victim or the scene that served as tangible reminders of the crime, allowing the killer to relive the experience afterward, and souvenirs, which served a similar memorial function but were typically less directly connected to the violent act itself. A killer who removed a piece of jewelry from a victim was collecting a souvenir. One who kept a body part was taking a trophy. Both behaviors indicated that the killing was serving a fantasy function, and that the offender needed to extend the psychological experience of the crime beyond the event itself, to carry it forward in time, to revisit it during periods of calm. Many serial offenders described using their collected items during later fantasy sessions, sometimes incorporating them into elaborate private rituals that recapitulated and intensified the original experience. The physical characteristics of entry and exit points at crime scenes also provided valuable behavioral data, revealing whether the offender had planned the entry carefully, perhaps selecting a home with a known vulnerability, or had acted impulsively, forcing entry through the nearest available opening. The condition of the exit told profilers about the offender's state of mind after the crime, whether they left methodically, taking time to clean up and remove evidence, or fled in a state of panic, leaving behind a trail of physical evidence. But perhaps the most consequential analytical distinction to emerge from the BSU's crime scene research was the difference between modus operandi and signature, a distinction that would prove transformative in linking serial cases across jurisdictions and across time. The modus operandi, or MO, encompassed the practical functional behaviors the offender employed to commit the crime, the techniques used to approach the victim, gain control, commit the act, and avoid detection. The MO was learned behavior, and critically, it evolved over time. A killer's MO in his first crime might be crude and inefficient, marked by mistakes and improvisation, but with each subsequent offence the MO would be refined based on experience. What worked would be repeated. What nearly led to capture would be abandoned. An offender might switch from using a ruse to gain entry to using forced entry, or might begin transporting victims to secondary locations after learning that attacking in the victim's home left too much evidence. Because the MO was functional and adaptive, it could change substantially over the course of a series, which meant that relying solely on MO to link cases was dangerously unreliable. The signature, however, was an entirely different category of behaviour. The signature was the emotional or psychological component of the crime, the behaviours that went beyond what was necessary to complete the offence, and that served the offender's deeper psychological needs. The signature was the killer's personal stamp, the ritualistic elements that were driven not by practicality, but by the fantasy that animated the criminal behaviour. And unlike the MO, the signature remained remarkably consistent across crimes, because it emerged from a stable psychological core, from needs and compulsions that did not change, simply because circumstances did. A killer whose signature involved binding victims in a specific elaborate pattern would continue to bind victims in that pattern even as other aspects of his criminal behavior evolved. One whose signature involved post-mortem posing would continue to pose even if the specific positions varied slightly, because the underlying need, the psychological gratification derived from the act of arrangement, remained constant. This distinction allowed profilers to do something that had been extraordinarily difficult before, link crimes that might look superficially different because the MO had changed, but that shared the same underlying signature because the same psychological engine was driving them. It was this precise analytical framework that would prove essential in understanding one of the most confounding serial murder cases in American criminal history. A case that stretched across 3 decades and demonstrated, in almost textbook fashion, both the power and the limitations of behavioral profiling. On January 15th, 1974, in Wichita, Kansas, 4 members of the Otero family were found dead in their home. Joseph Otero, age 38, and his wife Julie, age 34, had both been bound and strangled, along with 2 of their children, 9-year-old Joseph II and 11-year-old Josephine. The youngest victim had been found hanging from a pipe in the basement, and the crime scene showed clear evidence of elaborate binding techniques and prolonged interaction with the victims before their deaths. The killer had cut the phone lines before entering the home and had brought his own supplies, including cord and plastic bags, indicating a high degree of premeditation and organization. What struck investigators even in those earliest hours was the almost ritualistic quality of the bindings, the care with which the killer had restrained his victims, the sense that the process of binding itself was not merely functional, but was central to the killer's purpose. Over the months and years that followed, a series of additional murders in the Wichita area displayed the same disturbing signature. In April of 1974, 21-year-old Catherine Bright was stabbed to death in her home, and her brother Kevin was shot but survived. In March of 1977, Shirley Vian, 26, was bound and strangled in her home while her children were locked in a closet. In December of that same year, Nancy Fox, 25, was similarly bound and strangled. Across these crimes, the MO shifted and adapted, the killer sometimes entering through unlocked doors, sometimes cutting phone lines, sometimes waiting inside the home, sometimes approaching victims outside, but the signature remained hauntingly consistent. The binding, the control, the prolonged domination of victims before death, and an unmistakable sense that the killer derived his primary gratification not from the killing itself, but from the absolute power he exercised over his victims in the minutes and hours that preceded it. Then, in a development that elevated this case from a regional horror to a nationwide puzzle, the killer began communicating. In October of 1974, a letter was discovered in a book at the Wichita Public Library, a letter in which the author claimed responsibility for the Otero murders and described details that had not been released to the public. In the letter, the writer demonstrated an almost clinical detachment from his crimes, while simultaneously revealing a desperate hunger for recognition. He expressed frustration that the murders had not received more media attention, and complained that the press was not giving him the credit he felt he deserved. He also gave himself a name, offering several options before settling on BTK, an acronym that stood for Bind, Torture, Kill, a chillingly precise summary of his signature behavior. Over the following years, additional communications arrived, sent to police, to media outlets, and placed in public locations, each one reflecting the same paradoxical combination of careful, operational security and compulsive narcissistic exhibition. The BTK killer wanted to be feared and admired, wanted his crimes to be recognized as the work of a singular intelligence, yet also wanted to avoid capture. And this tension between the need for recognition and the need for self-preservation became itself a defining psychological characteristic that profilers would later use to predict his demographics and lifestyle. FBI profilers who consulted on the case constructed a profile that, viewed in retrospect, was remarkably prescient. They predicted that the offender would be a white male, likely in his late 20s to mid-30s at the time of the initial killings, of at least average intelligence and possibly above average, employed in a position that afforded him a degree of authority and control over others, likely married or in a long-term relationship, and deeply invested in maintaining a respectable public image. The profile noted that the elaborate bindings and the prolonged domination of victims suggested a fantasy life that had developed over many years before the first killing, one centered on themes of bondage, control, and power. The communications to police and media suggested a personality type that craved recognition and validation, that needed to be seen as exceptional, and that experienced the anonymity of his crimes as a form of psychological deprivation almost as painful as the compulsions that drove the killing. The profilers also predicted, based on the organized nature of the crimes and the offender's ability to maintain long dormant periods between killings, that this was someone with considerable self-discipline, someone who could compartmentalize his criminal life from his public persona with extraordinary effectiveness. This prediction was borne out with almost eerie precision when, after a long period of silence through the 1980s and most of the 1990s, during which profilers debated whether the killer had died, been incarcerated for another offence, or simply gone dormant, the BTK killer resurfaced. Beginning in March of 2004, new communications began arriving at media outlets in Wichita. The killer sent packages containing word puzzles, personal items taken from victims, and detailed descriptions of his crimes that left no doubt about the author's identity. He also claimed responsibility for additional murders that had not previously been attributed to him, including the 1985 killing of Maureen Hedge, the 1986 murder of Vicky Weigel, and the 1991 death of Dolores Davis. The communications revealed a personality that had only grown more grandiose during the decades of silence, a mind that had spent years constructing elaborate records of his crimes, including drawings, descriptions, and what he called projects, collections of materials related to potential victims he had stalked but not killed. The resumption of communications was itself a gift to investigators because it reflected the very narcissistic vulnerability that profilers had identified decades earlier. The killer simply could not tolerate being forgotten. Dennis Rader was arrested on February 25, 2005, and when his identity was revealed, the alignment between the profile and the reality was striking. He was 60 years old at the time of his arrest, meaning he had been 28 at the time of the Otero murders, squarely within the predicted age range. He had been married for 34 years and had 2 children. He had worked as an installer for the alarm company ADT, and later as a compliance officer for Park City, Kansas, a role that gave him authority to enter people's properties, inspect their homes, and issue citations, a position of petty power that perfectly matched the profiler's prediction of a need for control and authority in his daily life. Perhaps most remarkably, he had served as president of the Congregation Council at Christ Lutheran Church in Wichita, occupying a position of community leadership and moral authority that represented the ultimate expression of the double life the profile had predicted. In his post-arrest confessions and court statements, Rader described his crimes with a detachment that was itself diagnostically significant, discussing his victims as projects, describing his elaborate pre-offense surveillance and planning, and explaining the evolution of his fantasy life from childhood onward in terms that almost perfectly mirrored the developmental trajectory that FBI researchers had documented across hundreds of interviews with serial offenders. He described how the compulsions had been present since childhood, manifesting first in fantasies about bondage and control, then in the stalking of potential victims he called prospects, and finally in the commission of actual offences when fantasy alone could no longer contain the psychological pressure. His capture, when it finally came, was a product of the very narcissism that profilers had identified as his defining vulnerability. In his communications with police during 2004 and 2005, Rader had asked the investigating task force whether a floppy disk could be traced back to a specific computer. The police, recognizing the significance of the question, publicly stated through a newspaper advertisement that it could not. Trusting this assurance, Rader sent his next communication on a floppy disk, and forensic examination of the disk's metadata revealed a deleted file linked to Christ Lutheran Church and a user named Dennis. A simple internet search led investigators to Dennis Rader, president of the church council. A DNA sample obtained from his daughter's medical records at Kansas State University confirmed the match. The BTK case illustrated with painful clarity both the power of behavioral profiling in constructing accurate offender descriptions and the reality that profiling alone, absent the technological tools to translate behavioral predictions into specific identifications, could narrow but not close the gap between suspicion and arrest. What ultimately bridged that gap was a convergence of behavioral insight and digital forensics, a combination that would become increasingly important as profiling evolved in the 21st century. The BTK case also demonstrated something that geographic profilers had been arguing for years, that the spatial pattern of a killer's crimes could reveal as much about his identity as the behavioral pattern, because where a person kills is an expression of who they are and how they move through the world. Geographic profiling had emerged as a formal discipline in the 1990s, largely through the work of Kim Rossmo, a former Vancouver police detective who had earned a doctorate in criminology from Simon Fraser University, and who brought a mathematical rigour to the analysis of spatial patterns in serial crime that had previously been approached only through intuition and experience. Rossmo's central insight was that serial offenders, like all human beings, operated within mental maps, cognitive representations of their environment that were shaped by their home location, workplace, routine travel routes, and the places where they conducted the business of daily life. These mental maps defined a comfort zone, a geographic area within which the offender felt confident enough to commit crimes, and understanding the contours of that comfort zone could provide investigators with a powerful probabilistic tool for narrowing the search for an unknown offender's residence or base of operations. The theoretical foundation for geographic profiling drew on environmental criminology, and more specifically on routine activity theory, which held that crimes occurred at the intersection of a motivated offender, a suitable target, and the absence of a capable guardian, all situated within the spatial and temporal patterns of everyday life. Rossmo recognized that serial offenders did not select their hunting grounds at random. They gravitated toward areas they knew, areas they had traversed during the legitimate activities of their lives, areas where they understood the street layouts, the traffic patterns, the locations of potential witnesses, and the best routes of escape. This meant that the geographic distribution of crime sites, including encounter locations, attack sites, murder sites, and body disposal sites, was not random but was instead a distorted reflection of the offender's routine activity space. At the heart of Rossmo's methodology was an algorithm called criminal geographic targeting, or CGT, which processed the coordinates of linked crime sites through a distance decay function and produced a probability surface, essentially a color-coded map showing the relative likelihood that the offender's home or base was located within any given area of the geographic region under analysis. The mathematical model was based on two competing principles that Rossmo had observed in the spatial behavior of serial offenders. The first was the distance decay effect, the well-documented tendency for the frequency of crimes to decrease as distance from the offender's home increases, because the effort and risk associated with travel create a natural gravitational pull toward closer locations. The second was the buffer zone effect, the equally well-documented tendency for offenders to avoid committing crimes in the immediate vicinity of their home, where they might be recognized or where the proximity of the crime to their residence might draw suspicion. These two opposing forces created a characteristic spatial pattern, a ring of elevated criminal activity surrounding the offender's home, with lower activity at the center where the buffer zone suppressed offending, and lower activity at the periphery where distance decay reduced the likelihood of travel. By modeling this pattern mathematically and applying it to the known coordinates of a crime series, Rossmo's algorithm could generate a prioritized search area that dramatically reduced the geographic scope of an investigation. In practical terms, this meant that instead of searching an entire metropolitan area for an unknown offender, investigators could focus their resources on a much smaller zone where the probability of the offender's residence was highest. The buffer zone concept was particularly elegant in its psychological implications because it reflected a fundamental tension in the offender's behavioral calculus, the desire to hunt in familiar territory versus the need to maintain distance between criminal activity and the home environment where the offender's non-criminal identity was anchored. Different offenders resolve this tension differently, and Rossmo identified two broad spatial types that corresponded, in interesting ways, to the FBI's organized-disorganized typology. Marauders operated outward from a home base, committing crimes in various directions but always returning to a central anchor point, while commuters traveled to a distinct area away from their home before beginning to hunt, creating a pattern in which the crime cluster was geographically separated from the offender's residence. Recognizing which pattern was present in a given case was critical to the accurate application of geographic profiling, because the mathematical models that worked well for marauders could produce misleading results when applied to commuters, and vice versa. The real-world validation of geographic profiling came through its application to both solved and unsolved cases, and one of the most compelling demonstrations of its power involved the case of Peter Sutcliffe, the Yorkshire Ripper, who murdered 13 women and attacked at least 7 others in the north of England between 1975 and 1980. The investigation into Sutcliffe's crimes had been one of the largest and most troubled in British criminal history, hampered by the enormous volume of information flowing into the incident room, by interdepartmental communication failures, and most notoriously by a hoax tape and letters sent by a man called Wareside Jack, which convinced lead investigators that the killer had a Sunderland accent and caused them to deprioritise suspects who did not match that false criterion. Sutcliffe, who lived in Bradford and worked as a truck driver with regular routes throughout the region, was actually interviewed by police 9 times during the investigation without being identified as the killer. When geographic profiling techniques were retroactively applied to the Sutcliffe case, the results were striking. His home in Bradford fell squarely within the highest probability zone generated by the algorithm, and had such analysis been available during the original investigation, it would have provided a powerful basis for prioritising the enormous suspect pool that investigators were struggling to manage. The geographic distribution of Sutcliffe's crimes, concentrated in the areas of Leeds, Bradford, Halifax, Huddersfield and Manchester, with body disposal sites reflecting his knowledge of the road network gained through years of driving trucks, illustrated almost perfectly the principles of routine activity space and mental mapping that Rosmo's model was designed to exploit. No case in the history of serial murder investigation, however, provided a more comprehensive testing ground for the full range of profiling methodologies, both behavioural and geographic, than the Green River case, an investigation that spanned nearly 2 decades and involved the most prolific serial killer in confirmed American criminal history. The first victims began appearing in the summer of 1982, when the bodies of young women, most of them involved in sex work along the Pacific Highway South corridor near Seattle-Tacoma International Airport in Washington state, were discovered in and around the Green River in King County. By the end of 1983, the body count had risen at a staggering pace, and it was clear that the Seattle area was dealing with a serial killer operating at a scale and frequency that was virtually unprecedented. The Green River Killer Task Force was established in 1984, eventually growing to become one of the largest serial murder investigations in American history, and the FBI's Behavioral Science Unit was consulted early in the process. John Douglas himself travelled to Seattle to assist with the case, and the profile he and his colleagues developed, while necessarily broad given the enormous number of victims and the limited forensic evidence available, captured the essential outlines of the offender with remarkable accuracy. The profilers predicted a blue-collar male, likely in his early 30s, who lived or worked in the area immediately surrounding the Pacific Highway South Strip where most of the victims were last seen. They predicted someone with an extensive knowledge of the local geography, particularly the rural and semi-rural areas of King County, where bodies were being dumped, someone who was comfortable navigating logging roads, riverbanks and remote wooded areas. The victim selection pattern, focusing overwhelmingly on women involved in sex work, suggested an offender who was sexually motivated, but who targeted high-risk victims because he lacked the social sophistication to approach low-risk targets, or because the transactional nature of the encounter with sex workers provided a ready-made pretext for gaining access and control. The profilers also predicted that the offender would have a history of contact with sex workers independent of his criminal activity, that he might have prior arrests for solicitation or related offences, and that he would be physically unremarkable. Someone who blended into the environment of the highway corridor without drawing attention. The geographic pattern was equally revealing. The body disposal sites clustered along waterways and in wooded areas throughout King County, but the encounter sites, where the victims were last seen, were concentrated along a narrow stretch of Pacific Highway South, a fact that pointed to an offender whose routine activity space included this specific corridor, likely because he lived nearby, worked nearby, or both. Several of the disposal sites were located in areas that required detailed local knowledge to access, places that a casual visitor to the region would never find, which strongly suggested that the offender had grown up in the area or had spent years exploring it. The geographic profile pointed to a residential base close to the heart of the activity corridor, within a few miles of the Pacific Highway South Strip. Gary Leon Ridgway was first identified as a suspect as early as 1983, when he was arrested for soliciting an undercover police officer posing as a sex worker along the very stretch of highway where Green River victims were disappearing. He was interviewed by the task force in 1984 and passed a polygraph examination, a result that illustrates the limitation of that particular investigative tool when applied to individuals capable of extreme emotional compartmentalization. A DNA sample was obtained from Ridgway in 1987, but the forensic technology of the era was not yet sensitive enough to produce a definitive match with the biological evidence recovered from several victims. It was not until 2001, when advances in DNA analysis allowed the Washington State Crime Laboratory to retest the preserved evidence using short tandem repeat technology, that Ridgway's DNA was conclusively matched to semen recovered from the bodies of 3 Green River victims. He was arrested on November 30th, 2001, and in November of 2003, as part of a plea agreement in which he provided detailed information about all of his crimes in exchange for life imprisonment without the possibility of parole rather than the death penalty. Ridgway confessed to 48 murders, a number that was later increased to 49 with an additional conviction in 2011, though investigators believe the true number may exceed 70. What made Ridgway's post-arrest confession so valuable from a profiling perspective was the extraordinary degree to which they validated the behavioral predictions that had been made nearly 2 decades earlier. Ridgway described a methodology that was systematic, adaptive, and driven by a combination of sexual compulsion and a desire for control that perfectly matched the profile's predictions. He described how he would cruise the Pacific Highway South corridor, sometimes multiple times a day, making contact with sex workers, evaluating potential victims, and returning to specific locations where he had previously been successful. He described how he selected victims based on their perceived vulnerability and on his assessment of whether their disappearance would be quickly noticed, a calculus that was chillingly rational and that confirmed the profiler's analysis of his victim selection strategy. He explained how he evolved his methods over time, shifting from strangling victims in outdoor locations to bringing them to his home and later to his truck, and how he developed increasingly sophisticated techniques for disposing of bodies, including returning to dump sites to move remains when he feared they might be discovered. His MO had changed dramatically over the course of his 20-year killing career, shifting and adapting in response to close calls, changes in his personal circumstances, and the investigative pressure generated by the task force. But his signature, the fundamental pattern of approaching sex workers, gaining their trust through a transaction, and then exercising lethal control through manual strangulation, remained essentially constant throughout, exactly as profiling theory would have predicted. Ridgway also described, in terms that were almost textbook, the geographic component of his offending behavior. He confirmed that he operated almost entirely within his routine activity space, hunting along the highway corridor that connected his home to his workplace at the Kenworth Truck Factory in Renton, disposing of bodies in locations he had discovered during fishing trips, hiking, and other leisure activities throughout King County. His mental map of the region was extensive and detailed, built up over a lifetime of residence in the area, and it dictated every aspect of his spatial offending pattern, from the encounter sites to the kill sites to the disposal sites. He even described the buffer zone effect in his own words, noting that he was careful not to dump bodies too close to his home because he did not want to attract police attention to his neighbourhood. The geographic profile that could be constructed from his crime sites pointed directly to the area where he had lived for decades, a modest home on a residential street in Auburn, Washington, within easy driving distance of every significant location in the crime series. Perhaps most remarkably, Ridgway described his own internal experience in language that closely paralleled the theoretical frameworks that profilers had developed through their research. He spoke of a compulsion that built over time, an escalating internal pressure that could be temporarily relieved only through killing, and that would begin building again almost immediately afterward. He described elaborate fantasies that preceded his crimes, and that he would later revisit during periods between killings, using personal items taken from victims to enhance the fantasy experience. He acknowledged that the killing was, for him, primarily about control, about the moment when another human being's life was entirely in his hands, and that the sexual component, while present, was secondary to this fundamental power dynamic. He described, without having the clinical vocabulary to name it, the very cycle of fantasy, planning, acquisition, killing, and post-offense depression that the FBI's research had documented as the characteristic behavioral loop of serial sexual homicide offenders. The Green River case stood as a monument to both the achievements and the frustrations of behavioral profiling in the 20th century. The original profile had been substantially correct in its predictions about the offender's demographics, occupation, geographic base, social functioning, and psychological motivation. This convergence of behavioral insight and forensic technology pointed toward a future in which profiling would no longer stand alone as a purely psychological enterprise, but would instead become one component of a much larger investigative toolkit. And indeed, by the early 2000s, the field was already beginning to move in precisely this direction, as the evolution of profiling from pure behavioral analysis into a more interdisciplinary science that incorporated linguistics, digital forensics, and neuropsychology. As the behavioral sciences unit continued to refine its understanding of criminal psychology through the 1990s, a parallel discipline was quietly emerging that would prove just as revolutionary in the pursuit of serial offenders, and it began not with blood spatter or crime scene photography, but with words on a page, with the rhythms and patterns of human language itself, with the idea that the way a person constructs a sentence can be as unique and as traceable as the whorls of a fingerprint. The case that would bring forensic linguistics into the national consciousness was that of the man the FBI had been hunting for nearly 2 decades, a ghost who sent bombs through the mail and killed 3 people and injured 23 others between 1978 and 1995, the individual the Bureau had designated by the codename Unabomber, a contraction of university and airline bombing, and who the public came to know simply as the Unabomber. For 17 years, the investigation had consumed thousands of agent hours and produced very little in the way of actionable leads, and the forensic profile that had been developed over the years described a man of above-average intelligence, likely with an advanced degree, someone with a deep connection to wood and nature, possibly living in a rural or semi-rural environment, a loner with limited social connections and an intense ideological fixation on the dangers of modern technology and industrial society. The profile was remarkably accurate, as it turned out, but accuracy without identification is an exercise in frustration, and the case might have remained unsolved indefinitely, had it not been for a radical and deeply controversial decision that hinged entirely on the power of language. In September of 1995, after extensive internal debate and under the recommendation of agents who believed the risk was worth taking, the FBI agreed to allow the Washington Post and the New York Times to jointly publish the Unabomber's 35,000-word manifesto titled Industrial Society and Its Future, a dense and meticulously argued treatise on the erosion of human freedom by technological systems. The decision was controversial because it appeared to capitulate to a terrorist's demands, setting a dangerous precedent. But the agents involved understood something crucial, that the manifesto was not merely a political document, but a psychological one, a window into the mind of its author that was so detailed and so idiosyncratic that it might serve as the very thing they had been unable to produce through traditional investigation, which was a means of identification. The emerging field of forensic linguistics, championed within the Bureau by Special Agent James Fitzgerald, who would later become one of the foremost practitioners of the discipline, rested on a deceptively simple premise that every human being possesses what linguists call an idiolect, a unique constellation of language habits that includes word choice, syntactic structures, spelling preferences, punctuation tendencies, the use or avoidance of certain phrases, regional dialect markers, educational influences, and the subtle ideological frameworks that shape how a person organizes and presents an argument. Fitzgerald and the analysts who examined the manifesto catalogued dozens of distinctive linguistic markers, including the consistent use of the phrase cool-headed logicians, and the unusual construction eat your cake and have it too, rather than the conventional American English ordering of have your cake and eat it too, along with particular hyphenation choices, a distinctive approach to compound modifiers, and the embedding of academic philosophical references that suggested training in the social sciences or humanities at a high level. These were not the kinds of clues that would appear in a fingerprint database or a DNA registry. They were the traces of a mind's particular way of processing and expressing thought, and they were, in their own way, just as individual. When the manifesto was published, a social worker in upstate New York named Linda Patrick read portions of it and felt a chill of recognition, not because she knew the Unabomber, but because the ideas and the particular way they were expressed reminded her of her husband's brother, a man named Ted Kaczynski. She brought her concerns to her husband, David Kaczynski, who initially resisted the idea that his own brother could be responsible for such violence, but who eventually, after agonizing deliberation, retrieved letters and documents that Ted had sent to the family over the years and compared them to the manifesto. The similarities were not merely thematic, they were structural and linguistic. The same unusual phrasings, the same idiosyncratic constructions, the same intellectual framework expressed in the same distinctive voice. David Kaczynski made what must have been one of the most painful decisions any family member has ever faced and contacted the FBI through an intermediary, and the linguistic analysis conducted by Fitzgerald and his colleagues confirmed what David had suspected, that the author of the manifesto and the author of Ted Kaczynski's personal correspondence were, with a very high degree of probability, the same person. When agents arrested Ted Kaczynski at his remote cabin in Lincoln, Montana in April of 1996, they found not only bomb-making materials but also the original handwritten draft of the manifesto, and the case became a landmark demonstration of how language analysis could succeed, where traditional forensic methods had failed for nearly 2 decades. The implications extended far beyond a single case, for in an age of increasing digital communication, where individuals leave vast trails of written text through emails, forum posts, social media updates, manifestos, and anonymous messages, the science of forensic linguistics offered a powerful new tool for investigative profiling, one that could analyze not just what a person said, but how they said it, mapping the deep structures of thought and expression that remain remarkably consistent even when a writer attempts to disguise their identity. The concept of forensic linguistics would go on to be applied in cases involving threatening letters, ransom notes, disputed authorship of confessions, and the analysis of online communications in terrorism investigations, and it represented a profound expansion of what profiling could mean, moving beyond the physical crime scene and into the landscape of language itself, where every sentence is a scene and every word choice is a piece of evidence. The discipline that James Fitzgerald helped to pioneer within the FBI became a quiet but essential component of modern investigative analysis, a reminder that the mind reveals itself not only through actions, but through the particular and deeply personal way it translates thought into words. And it was precisely this understanding of how the mind reveals itself, not just through written language but through spoken behavior under pressure, that would become one of the most powerful and most ethically contested tools in the profiler's arsenal, the art and science of interrogation, the carefully orchestrated process by which investigators attempt to penetrate the psychological defenses of a suspect and elicit a confession, a process that draws on everything the behavioral sciences had learned about the architecture of criminal personalities and the specific vulnerabilities that different types of offenders present. The interrogation room is a theatre of psychology, a confined space where every element, from the positioning of chairs to the temperature of the room to the timing of silences, is calibrated to create a particular psychological effect, and the profiler's role in this theatre is to serve as a kind of director, identifying which approach is most likely to succeed with a given suspect, based on everything that is known about their psychological type, their crime scene behaviour, their personal history, and their particular constellation of needs and fears. The most widely known interrogation framework in American law enforcement for decades was the Reed technique, developed by John E. Reed and Associates beginning in the 1950s, a structured 9-step process that begins with a direct positive confrontation in which the interrogator states their belief in the suspect's guilt and proceeds through a carefully choreographed sequence of theme development, handling denials, overcoming objections, retaining the suspect's attention, handling the suspect's passive mood, presenting an alternative question, developing oral confession details, and converting the oral confession to a written one. The Reed technique was built on the premise that guilty individuals display identifiable behavioral cues under questioning, that deception produces observable physiological and psychological stress responses, and that a skilled interrogator can use these observations to guide the interrogation toward confession. For decades, it was the dominant model in American law enforcement training, but it also attracted significant criticism, particularly as research accumulated suggesting that the behavioral cues Reed practitioners were trained to identify as indicators of deception, such as gaze aversion, fidgeting, and certain verbal hedging patterns, were far less reliable than the technique's proponents claimed, and that the confrontational and psychologically pressurized nature of the Reed approach could, in certain circumstances, produce false confessions, particularly from vulnerable populations including juveniles, individuals with intellectual disabilities, and those suffering from mental illness. What the behavioral profilers brought to the interrogation process was a more nuanced and individualized approach, one grounded in the typological frameworks they had developed through years of prison interviews and crime scene analysis. For the organized offender, the narcissistic and controlling personality who took pride in the sophistication of their crimes and who maintained a carefully constructed public persona, the most effective approach was often one that engaged their ego, that treated them as an intellectual equal, that acknowledged the complexity and planning evident in their offences, and that created a conversational dynamic in which the suspect felt they were participating in an elevated discussion rather than being subjected to an interrogation. Douglas found that organised offenders often responded to what he called intellectual challenge, the suggestion that only someone of considerable intelligence could have committed the crime in question, and that by engaging the suspect's narcissism, an interrogator could sometimes induce them to reveal details that they would never have disclosed under a more confrontational approach, because the need to be recognised as clever and capable overrode the instinct for self-preservation. For the disorganized offender, by contrast, the approach was fundamentally different. These individuals, who were often socially isolated, cognitively limited, and operating under the influence of severe mental illness or profound emotional disturbance, responded poorly to intellectual challenge and ego feeding, and were more likely to confess when met with simple empathy, patient repetition of basic questions, and a tone that conveyed understanding rather than accusation. At the heart, the profiler's skill lay in identifying which theme would resonate with a particular suspect's psychological needs, which narrative would align with the story the suspect was already telling themselves about their own actions, and this required a depth of psychological insight that went far beyond the mechanical application of technique. One of the most striking modern examples of how methodical interrogation can dismantle a carefully constructed persona occurred in February of 2010, when Detective Sergeant Jim Smith of the Ontario Provincial Police interrogated Colonel Russell Williams, a decorated Canadian military officer and base commander at CFB Trenton, who had been living a secret life as a serial burglar, sexual predator, and murderer. Smith's interrogation, which has been widely studied as a masterclass in psychological interviewing, did not rely on aggressive confrontation or theatrical displays of authority, but instead employed a calm, measured, almost conversational presentation of forensic evidence, tire track analysis, bootprint comparisons, and geographic data that systematically closed every avenue of escape that Williams's organised and disciplined mind attempted to construct. Smith spoke quietly, methodically, respectfully, laying out each piece of evidence like a card being placed on a table. And what observers noted was the visible collapse of Williams's facade over the course of the interview, the moment when the organised personality's confidence in their own ability to control the narrative crumbled under the weight of undeniable physical evidence presented without anger or accusation, and Williams not only confessed, but provided detailed accounts of his crimes and led investigators to evidence they had not yet discovered. The ethical debates surrounding interrogation psychology remain intense and unresolved, with critics arguing that any technique designed to psychologically manipulate a suspect into confessing carries inherent risks of producing false confessions and violating the spirit, if not the letter, of constitutional protections against self-incrimination, while proponents counter that skilled psychological interviewing, when conducted within legal boundaries and with proper safeguards, remains one of the most effective tools available for resolving violent crime and bringing closure to victims' families. The tension between effectiveness and ethics in the interrogation room mirrors a broader tension within the field of criminal profiling itself, the uncomfortable truth that the tools which are most powerful are also the tools which are most easily misused, and that the line between legitimate psychological insight and manipulative coercion requires constant vigilance to maintain. And so, as the 20th century gave way to the 21st, and as the science of behavioral profiling continued to refine itself in the shadow of these difficult ethical questions, there emerged a case that would demonstrate both the remarkable prescience of criminal profiling and the extraordinary patience that justice sometimes demands, a case that had lingered in the files of California law enforcement for decades like a wound that refused to heal, and that would ultimately be solved not by profiling alone, but by a revolutionary fusion of behavioral science and cutting-edge genetic technology that no one could have foreseen when the crimes first began. The individual who would come to be known by many names, the East Area Rapist, the original Night Stalker, the Visalia Ransacker, and eventually, in a grim unification of these identities, the Golden State Killer, had terrorized the state of California across a sprawling 12-year reign of violence that began in 1974 and did not cease until 1986, leaving behind at least 13 murdered victims and more than 50 survivors of sexual assault, along with over 100 burglaries, a trail of suffering so vast and so geographically dispersed that it took investigators years simply to recognize that one individual was responsible for all of it. The crimes had begun in the farming communities around Visalia, where a prowler was breaking into homes with an almost surgical precision, ransacking drawers and closets with a meticulousness that suggested not greed but compulsion, a need to invade and violate private spaces that would only deepen and darken as the years progressed. By 1976, the offender had shifted his operations to the Sacramento area, where he began committing a series of rapes that were distinguished by their terrifying ritualism, the attacker binding couples in their own homes, stacking dishes on the back of the male victim and threatening to kill everyone in the house if he heard the dishes fall, a tactic of psychological domination that behavioral analysts would later recognize as the hallmark of a deeply organized power reassurance offender who derives satisfaction not merely from the sexual violence itself, but from the total subjugation of his victims and the theatrical control of every element of the encounter. Over the course of the next several years, the attacks escalated in both violence and geographic range, moving south through California into the affluent communities of the San Francisco Bay Area, and eventually into Southern California, where the offender began killing his victims, couples found bludgeoned and shot in their own bedrooms, the scene staged with the same eerie discipline that had characterized the earlier assaults. Behavioral profiles constructed during these years painted a portrait that was, in retrospect, remarkably accurate, describing an offender who was likely white, male, in his mid-20s to 30s during the peak of the offences, physically fit and agile given his ability to scale fences and flee through backyards with ease, almost certainly possessing a military or law enforcement background based on his comfort with firearms, his sophisticated counter-forensic awareness, his ability to conduct extensive pre-offence surveillance without detection, and his apparent understanding of police response times and investigative procedures. The profile suggested a man who was deeply territorial, who knew the neighbourhoods he attacked with an intimacy that spoke of prolonged stalking, who was likely employed in a position that afforded him both flexible hours and access to the communities he targeted, and who possessed a need for power and control so profound that it structured every element of his offending behaviour. And then, as suddenly as it had begun, the violence stopped. After 1986, there were no more attacks that could be linked to the offender, and the case, despite the enormous investigative resources that had been devoted to it, went cold. Detectives retired, witnesses aged, survivors carried their trauma into the long silence of the decades that followed, many of them never knowing whether the man who had shattered their lives was dead, imprisoned for other crimes, or simply living quietly somewhere beyond the reach of justice. DNA evidence collected from the crime scenes was preserved and eventually entered into law enforcement databases as forensic technology advanced, but no match was ever returned, meaning the offender had never been convicted of a qualifying crime in any jurisdiction, a fact that only deepened the frustration of the investigators who had spent their careers pursuing him. The case might have remained in this state of indefinite suspension were it not for a convergence of technological innovation and human determination that arrived in the spring of 2018, when Detective Paul Holes of the Contra Costa County District Attorney's Office, who had spent 24 years investigating the case and was on the verge of retirement, partnered with a genealogist named Barbara Ray Venter to attempt something that had never been done before in a criminal investigation of this magnitude. The technique they employed, which would come to be known as investigative genetic genealogy, involved uploading a DNA profile derived from crime scene evidence to GEDmatch, a free, publicly accessible genealogy database where hundreds of thousands of individuals had voluntarily shared their genetic information in the hope of connecting with distant relatives and tracing their ancestral roots. Unlike the law enforcement DNA databases that had returned no match for decades, GEDmatch operated on a different principle entirely, one that did not require the offender himself to be in the database, but merely required that some distant relative, a third cousin, a fourth cousin, someone who shared even a small fraction of the offender's genetic material, had uploaded their own profile, and indeed the search returned partial matches, not to the offender directly, but to individuals who shared enough DNA to be identified as distant relatives, and from these fragmentary genetic connections, Ray Venter began the painstaking work of building family trees, tracing lineages backward through generations and then forward again through branches and marriages and births, narrowing the field of potential suspects through a process that combined the rigor of genetic science with the patient, archival craft of genealogical research. The family trees eventually converged on a single individual, a man named Joseph James D'Angelo, who was 72 years old and living in quiet retirement in a modest house in Citrus Heights, a suburb of Sacramento, the very region where the earliest rapes had been committed more than 4 decades before. When investigators discreetly collected a discarded DNA sample from D'Angelo's trash and compared it to the crime scene evidence, the match was confirmed, and on April 24, 2018, D'Angelo was arrested on his front lawn, a stooped and seemingly unremarkable elderly man who had been hiding in plain sight for more than 30 years. The revelation of his identity sent shockwaves through both the law enforcement community and the public at large, not only because of the sheer duration of his concealment, but because of what he turned out to be: a former police officer, a man who had served with the Exeter Police Department, and later the Auburn Police Department during the very years when the earliest crimes were being committed, who had in fact been fired from the Auburn Department in 1979 for shoplifting, a petty offence that ended his law enforcement career, but did nothing to halt his predatory violence. The behavioural profile had been right. The prediction of a law enforcement or military background, which had been made decades earlier based on the offender's operational sophistication, his counter-forensic awareness, and his apparent understanding of police procedures, was confirmed with an almost uncanny precision that underscored the genuine analytical power of behavioural profiling, even as it highlighted the frustrating limitation that a profile, no matter how accurate, can describe a type of person without being able to name the specific individual. In 2020, D'Angelo pleaded guilty to 13 counts of first-degree murder and 13 counts of kidnapping, receiving a sentence of life in prison without the possibility of parole, a resolution that brought a measure of closure to survivors and families who had waited decades for an answer. The implications of the case extended far beyond the fate of one offender. In the years following D'Angelo's arrest, investigative genetic genealogy was used to solve dozens of cold cases across the country, identifying suspects in serial murders, sexual assaults, and unidentified remains cases that had languished for decades, fundamentally altering the landscape of cold case investigation and establishing a new paradigm in which the boundaries between behavioral profiling and forensic identification were bridged by a technology that could translate the abstract insights of profiling. This is the kind of person you're looking for, into the concrete specificity of a name and an address. The Golden State Killer case stood as a testament to the enduring value of behavioral analysis, while simultaneously demonstrating that profiling alone, no matter how sophisticated, could not substitute for the forensic tools needed to make an identification, a lesson that carried with it a sobering corollary about the limits of profiling and the dangers that could arise when those limits were not properly respected. For if the D'Angelo case represented the best of what criminal profiling could achieve, a decades-old behavioral portrait vindicated by technological innovation and patient detective work, there existed other cases that illustrated the worst, cases in which the power of the profile, the seductive certainty of a psychological portrait that seemed to explain everything, led investigators not toward the truth, but away from it, into a tunnel of confirmation bias, from which innocent people emerged with their reputations destroyed and their lives irreparably damaged. Perhaps no case illustrated this danger more vividly than the story of Richard Jewell, a security guard working at Centennial Olympic Park during the 1996 Summer Olympics in Atlanta, Georgia, who on the night of July 27th, 1996, noticed a suspicious backpack beneath a bench in the crowded park and alerted law enforcement, an act of vigilance that almost certainly saved lives, when the backpack was revealed to contain a pipe bomb packed with nails and screws that detonated shortly afterward, killing one person and injuring more than 100 others. In the immediate aftermath of the bombing, Jewell was celebrated as a hero, the observant everyman whose training and instincts had prevented a far greater catastrophe. But within days, the narrative shifted with devastating speed when the FBI, constructing a behavioral profile of the likely bomber, developed a theory that the perpetrator fit the archetype of a lone bomber who craved public recognition and might have planted the device precisely so that he could discover it and bask in the ensuing attention. Jewell, a heavyset, earnest, somewhat socially awkward man who had eagerly cooperated with media interviews and who had a history of seeking employment in law enforcement, seemed to fit this profile with an almost too convenient precision, and the investigation turned its focus squarely upon him, a shift that was amplified catastrophically when his name was leaked to the media and the Atlanta Journal-Constitution published a story identifying him as a suspect. For 88 days, Richard Jewell lived under a siege of suspicion, his apartment searched by federal agents, his every movement scrutinized by television cameras stationed permanently outside his door, his character dissected in newspapers and on talk shows by commentators who treated the profile as if it were evidence of guilt rather than a speculative analytical tool. He was never charged, because there was never any evidence connecting him to the bombing, and in October 1996 the Department of Justice sent him a letter formally clearing him as a suspect. But the damage had been done, and the remaining years of Jewell's life before his death, from heart failure in 2007 at the age of 44, were shaped indelibly by the experience of having been publicly branded as a terrorist on the basis of a behavioural profile that, however internally logical it may have seemed, bore no actual relationship to the truth. The actual bomber, Eric Robert Rudolph, a far-right extremist motivated by anti-abortion and anti-government ideology, was not identified until 2003 and bore virtually no resemblance to the profile that had ensnared Jewell. The Jewell case was not an isolated failure. In 2004, in the aftermath of the devastating train bombings in Madrid, Spain, that killed 193 people, the FBI laboratory identified what it believed to be a match between a fingerprint found on a bag of detonators near the scene and the prints of Brandon Mayfield, an attorney living in Portland, Oregon, who had no connection to Spain, no history of violence, and no apparent motive for involvement in international terrorism. What Mayfield did have was a conversion to Islam and a legal practice that had once included the representation of a defendant in a terrorism-related case, demographic and associative details that, while entirely irrelevant to the forensic question of whether the fingerprint actually matched, created a context in which the match seemed to make narrative sense to investigators already primed by the assumptions of demographic profiling. Mayfield was arrested and held for 2 weeks as a material witness before Spanish authorities identified the print as belonging to an Algerian national, and the FBI was forced to acknowledge that its identification had been erroneous, an error compounded by the cognitive biases that had made investigators more willing to accept a marginal match, because the suspect fit a preconceived profile of who a terrorist ought to be. These cases, and others like them, prompted serious scholarly examination of the empirical foundations of criminal profiling itself. A 2007 meta-analysis of the existing research on profiling accuracy, conducted by researchers who reviewed the available experimental studies in which profilers and non-profilers were asked to make predictions about offender characteristics based on crime scene information, found that while professional profilers did perform somewhat better than untrained individuals on certain specific tasks, the overall advantage was modest, far more modest than the dramatic portrayals of profiling in popular culture would suggest, and that on some measures there was no statistically significant difference between the predictions of trained profilers and those of other experienced professionals such as detectives or clinical psychologists who had no specific training in criminal profiling. These findings did not mean that profiling was without value, but they did suggest that its value was more circumscribed, more contingent, and more susceptible to the same cognitive biases that afflict all forms of human judgment than its most enthusiastic proponents had acknowledged. In response to these criticisms, the field of criminal profiling underwent a period of significant self-examination, with many practitioners and academics emphasizing that profiles were most appropriately understood as hypothesis-generating tools, frameworks for organizing investigative thinking and prioritizing leads, rather than as identification tools capable of pointing to a specific individual, and that the presentation of profile evidence in court, where it might carry an unwarranted aura of scientific authority, was inappropriate and potentially prejudicial, a position reflected in the fact that most courts in the United States and elsewhere have declined to admit criminal profiles as evidence of guilt. The distinction between profiling as an investigative aid and profiling as evidence became a central tenet of responsible practice in the field, an acknowledgement that the same analytical framework that could helpfully narrow the field of investigation could, if treated with excessive certainty or applied with insufficient critical scrutiny, lead investigators into precisely the kind of tunnel vision that had consumed Richard Jewell and Brandon Mayfield, transforming a useful tool into an instrument of injustice. And it was precisely this kind of tension between the power of profiling and its potential for error that would be thrown into sharp and painful relief by a case that shook public confidence in the FBI's behavioral analysis capabilities and forced a fundamental re-examination of the demographic assumptions that had quietly shaped criminal profiling since its inception. In October of 2002, the Washington, D.C. metropolitan area was gripped by a terror that was unlike anything the region had experienced. A series of seemingly random shootings in which victims were killed while performing the most mundane of daily activities: pumping gas, mowing a lawn, loading purchases into a car, standing on a street corner, and the sheer randomness of the attacks, combined with the sniper's apparent ability to strike and vanish without leaving witnesses or physical evidence, created a pervasive atmosphere of fear that altered the daily behavior of millions of people across Maryland, Virginia, and the District of Columbia. In the first 48 hours alone, 5 people were killed in Montgomery County, Maryland, and within the first 3 weeks 10 people would be dead and 3 critically wounded, and the entire region existed in a state of sustained dread that was compounded by the complete absence of any apparent motive or pattern beyond the geographical clustering of the attacks in suburban commercial areas. As the investigation mobilized on an enormous scale, involving the FBI, the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms and Explosives, multiple state and local law enforcement agencies, and hundreds of investigators, criminal profilers were called upon to provide analysis that might help narrow the search, and the profiles that emerged reflected the accumulated wisdom of decades of serial crime analysis, but also, as events would reveal, the accumulated biases. The initial behavioral profile suggested a lone white male, likely in his 20s or 30s, possibly with military experience given the accuracy of the shots, someone who lived or worked in the area and who was motivated by a desire for power and control, the standard demographic and psychological template for the American serial killer, as derived from the FBI's extensive database of case studies and prison interviews. The profile was not unreasonable, given the statistical base rates, as the overwhelming majority of serial killers in the FBI's records were indeed white males. But it carried within it an assumption that would prove dangerously misleading: the assumption that statistical probability could substitute for specific evidence in an active investigation. As the shootings continued and the investigation expanded, witnesses reported seeing a white van or white box truck in the vicinity of several shooting locations, and this detail, amplified by media coverage and repeated in thousands of tips to the investigation's hotline, became fixed in the public consciousness, and, more consequentially, in the operational focus of law enforcement at checkpoints and during traffic stops. The white van phenomenon became a textbook example of confirmation bias in action, as the sheer number of white vans and box trucks on American roads at any given time meant that witnesses were almost guaranteed to recall seeing one near any outdoor location, and once the detail was publicized, subsequent witnesses were primed to notice and report white vans while filtering out other vehicles, creating a self-reinforcing cycle of seemingly corroborating reports that were in reality artifacts of selective attention. The actual shooters, as the world would eventually learn, were John Allen Muhammad, a 41-year-old black man and Gulf War veteran, and Lee Boyd Malvo, a 17-year-old Jamaican national who had come under Muhammad's influence, and they were operating not from a white van but from a blue 1990 Chevrolet Caprice sedan that had been modified with a hole cut in the trunk through which Malvo could fire a Bushmaster X M15 rifle, while the car was stationary and appearing innocuous. The Caprice had been stopped and checked by law enforcement multiple times during the 3-week rampage, but had been released each time because its occupants did not match the expected profile. 2 black males in a dark sedan bore no resemblance to the anticipated lone white male in a white van, and while it is impossible to know with certainty that a different profile would have led to earlier identification, the case raised deeply uncomfortable questions about the role of demographic assumptions in criminal profiling and the potentially deadly consequences of allowing statistical generalizations to override the specific evidence of a particular case. Muhammad and Malvo were ultimately identified not through behavioral profiling, but through a convergence of other investigative threads, including a telephone call to the tip line in which Muhammad referenced an unsolved robbery murder in Montgomery, Alabama, that was linked to him through fingerprint evidence, and it was this connection that provided the names and vehicle description that led to their arrest at a rest stop off Interstate 70 in Maryland on October 24, 2002, found sleeping in the Caprice with the rifle and other evidence. The DC sniper case forced a reckoning within the profiling community about the distinction between serial killers operating from purely psychological motivations and offenders who kill serially, but whose motivations are rooted in personal vendettas, political agendas, or in Muhammad's case, what appeared to be a complex mixture of personal grievance related to a custody dispute with his ex-wife, ideological radicalization, and a desire to create a cover pattern that would mask the eventual targeted killing of his former spouse. The case also highlighted the critical difference between a serial killer, in the traditional sense, and what some analysts termed a spree killer or serial sniper, where the methodology and motivation deviated significantly from the patterns that the FBI's behavioral models had been designed to analyze, and it served as a humbling reminder that profiles are probabilistic tools rather than deterministic ones, that they describe likelihoods rather than certainties, and that when investigators treat a profile as a factual description of an unknown suspect rather than as a set of hypotheses to be tested against evidence, the consequences can be severe. The lessons of the DC sniper case would ripple through the profiling community for years, contributing to a broader movement toward what some researchers called evidence-based profiling, an approach that sought to ground behavioral analysis more firmly in empirical research and statistical methodology, while remaining honest about the limitations of demographic generalizations. And it was this same impulse toward greater scientific rigor that would lead the field of criminal profiling to engage with perhaps the most profound development in the understanding of violent criminal behavior since the invention of the organized-disorganized typology itself, the revolution in neuroscience that was beginning to reveal, through the extraordinary technology of modern brain imaging, the physical substrates of the psychological patterns that profilers had been observing and cataloguing for decades, the actual neural architecture of psychopathy and predatory violence. The advent of functional magnetic resonance imaging and positron emission tomography scanning in the late 20th and early 21st centuries opened a window into the living human brain that had never before existed, allowing researchers to observe not just the structure of neural tissue, but its activity in real time, to watch which regions of the brain activated in response to particular stimuli and which remained conspicuously silent, and when these technologies were applied to the study of individuals diagnosed with psychopathy and antisocial personality disorder, the results were both fascinating and deeply unsettling. The amygdala, a small almond-shaped structure deep within the temporal lobes that plays a central role in processing emotions, particularly fear and empathy, showed consistently reduced activation in psychopathic individuals when they were presented with stimuli designed to evoke emotional responses, images of suffering, sounds of distress, scenarios requiring moral judgment, and this deficit was not subtle but dramatic. A measurable and reproducible difference that suggested the emotional flatness and lack of empathy that clinicians had long observed in psychopathic individuals was not merely a psychological trait but a neurological one, rooted in the physical structure and function of the brain itself. Kent Keel, a neuroscientist at the University of New Mexico and one of the foremost researchers in the neuroscience of psychopathy, took the extraordinary step of bringing a mobile MRI unit into maximum security prisons, scanning the brains of hundreds of incarcerated individuals and building what became one of the largest neuroimaging datasets of criminal psychopathy in the world. Keel's research revealed not just amygdala deficits, but a broader pattern of reduced grey matter density and functional connectivity in what he termed the paralimbic system, a network of brain regions including the orbital frontal cortex, the anterior cingulate cortex, the insula, and the temporal poles that collectively underlie emotional processing, decision-making, impulse control, and moral reasoning. The prefrontal cortex, the brain region most associated with executive function, long-term planning, impulse regulation, and the ability to anticipate consequences, showed particularly striking deficits in individuals who had committed impulsive violent crimes, and while the relationship between prefrontal dysfunction and violence was not simple or deterministic, it provided a neurological framework for understanding the impulsivity and poor decision-making that characterized many disorganized offenders, the individuals whose crime scenes reflected chaos and lack of planning. The nature versus nurture debate, which had always hovered over discussions of criminal psychology, acquired new dimensions as genetic research identified specific variants that appeared to interact with environmental factors to increase the risk of violent behavior. The most widely discussed was the monoamine oxidase A gene, sometimes called the warrior gene in popular media, a label that most researchers regarded as misleading and reductive, variants of which were associated with altered metabolism of neurotransmitters including serotonin, norepinephrine, and dopamine. Research suggested that individuals carrying low-activity variants of the MAOA gene, who also experienced severe childhood maltreatment, abuse, neglect, or exposure to violence, were significantly more likely to develop antisocial behavior than individuals with either the genetic variant alone or the environmental exposure alone, a finding that pointed toward a gene-environment interaction model in which biology and experience conspired to shape the neural circuits underlying aggression and impulse control. This convergence of neuroscience and behavioral observation was, for many profilers, a vindication of sorts, a confirmation through brain imaging and genetic analysis of patterns they had been documenting through clinical observation and crime scene analysis for decades. When Robert Ressler described the childhood triad of fire setting, animal cruelty, and bedwetting as indicators of future violent behavior, he was observing, without the benefit of neuroimaging, the behavioral manifestations of the same neurological and developmental disruptions that Keel and others were now mapping at the level of neural circuitry. But the neuroscience revolution also raised profoundly troubling ethical questions that the field has yet to resolve. For if psychopathy has identifiable biological markers, if the capacity for empathy and moral reasoning is diminished by neural deficits that the individual did not choose and cannot fully control, then the traditional framework of criminal responsibility, which assumes a rational agent making free choices, becomes deeply complicated. The question of whether a brain scan showing reduced amygdala function should mitigate criminal punishment, or conversely whether individuals identified as neurologically predisposed to violence should be subject to enhanced monitoring or preventive intervention before they commit any crime, touches on fundamental issues of justice, autonomy, and the very meaning of moral agency, questions that the legal system is only beginning to grapple with, and that have no easy answers. What the neuroscience of psychopathy offered to the practical work of criminal profiling was not a replacement for behavioral analysis, but an enrichment of it, a deeper understanding of why certain offenders behaved as they did, why some showed no emotional response during interrogation while others broke down in tears, why some crime scenes were meticulously organized and others were chaotic and frenzied, and why the patterns that profilers had identified through decades of painstaking empirical observation were not arbitrary classifications but reflections of genuine underlying differences in how criminal minds were wired. As the field of criminal profiling moved into the 21st century, it found itself at the intersection of multiple technological and methodological revolutions that were transforming not just how crimes were investigated, but how human behavior was understood. The Violent Criminal Apprehension Program, known as VICAP, which had been established by the FBI in 1985 as a centralized database for collecting and analyzing information about violent crimes, particularly serial homicides, sexual assaults, and missing persons cases, represented an early attempt to use data aggregation to identify patterns across jurisdictions, but it had been plagued from its inception by chronic underutilization, as the detailed and time-consuming reporting forms required for each case entry deterred many local law enforcement agencies from participating, and by the mid-2000s, estimates suggested that fewer than 15% of eligible cases were being entered into the system, severely limiting its analytical power. The promise of what VICAP represented, however, the idea that patterns invisible at the local level might become visible when data from across the country was aggregated and analysed, that serial offenders who moved between jurisdictions could be identified through the computational comparison of case characteristics. This promise was being revived and expanded by advances in machine learning and artificial intelligence that offered the possibility of analysing vastly larger datasets with far greater speed and sophistication than any human analyst could achieve. Researchers at universities and technology companies began developing algorithms trained on historical case data that could identify statistical correlations between crime scene characteristics, offender demographics, geographic patterns, and temporal factors, algorithms that could process thousands of cases simultaneously and flag potential linkages that might otherwise go unnoticed. And while these tools were still in their early stages and carried significant limitations related to the quality and representativeness of their training data, they represented a fundamental shift in the relationship between human judgment and computational analysis in criminal investigation. The digital age had also created an entirely new category of behavioral evidence that profilers of previous generations could never have imagined. The vast and detailed digital footprints that modern individuals leave through their online activities, search engine queries, social media posts, location data from mobile devices, purchasing histories, browsing patterns, and digital communications. The concept of a behavioral profile, which for John Douglas and Robert Ressler had meant a document synthesizing crime scene analysis, victimology, and psychological theory into a narrative description of an unknown offender, now had the potential to include algorithmically generated assessments of an individual's digital behavior, their interests, their social networks, their emotional states as reflected in their online communications, and their geographic movements as recorded by the devices they carried. This evolution intersected with different methodological traditions that had developed outside the FBI's clinical approach, most notably the investigative psychology framework pioneered by David Cantor, a British psychologist whose work sought to place criminal profiling on a more rigorous empirical foundation by applying statistical methods including multidimensional scaling and smallest space analysis to large data sets of criminal behaviour. Cantor's approach, which he developed at the University of Liverpool beginning in the late 1980s, emphasised geographic profiling, the analysis of the spatial relationships between crime locations and an offender's likely home base, or anchor point, and it represented a more quantitative and less intuition-dependent methodology than the FBI's approach, one that could be replicated and tested and that produced probabilistic predictions amenable to empirical validation. The Israeli approach to criminal profiling, developed within the framework of that country's security and intelligence services, brought yet another perspective, one shaped by the particular challenges of terrorism analysis and threat assessment, and the convergence of these different national and methodological traditions in the early 21st century created a richer and more multifaceted discipline than any single approach could have produced on its own. And yet, amid all the technological sophistication and methodological advancement, amid the algorithms and the brain scans and the digital forensics and the geographic probability surfaces, there remained at the core of criminal profiling something that could not be digitized or automated, something that resisted quantification, and that ultimately depended on a capacity that was as old as human consciousness itself. The ability of one mind to imagine its way into the experience of another, to sit with the evidence of terrible acts and to ask not just what happened and how it happened, but why it happened. What need was being met? What fantasy was being enacted? What wound was being expressed through violence? And this capacity, this willingness to enter imaginatively into the darkest spaces of human psychology, was both the great strength of the profiling discipline and the source of its most devastating personal cost. John Douglas, who had spent years immersing himself in the minds of serial killers and had interviewed some of the most prolific and disturbing offenders in American history, collapsed from viral encephalitis in December of 1983, and while the immediate cause was a viral infection, colleagues and physicians noted that the extraordinary psychological stress of his work had severely compromised his immune system, and his collapse was widely understood within the Bureau as a warning about the toll that sustained exposure to the worst of human behaviour could exact on even the most resilient mind. Robert Ressler, who had coined the very term serial killer and who had sat across the table from Edmund Kemper, John Wayne Gacy, Jeffrey Dahmer, and dozens of other men whose crimes defined the outer boundaries of human cruelty, spoke in his later years about the nightmares that had been his constant companion throughout his career, and that continued long after his retirement, dreams in which the faces and voices of the killers he'd interviewed blended with scenes of violence that his waking mind could not entirely suppress, and he acknowledged that the work had changed him in ways that were not entirely healable, that to spend one's career in deliberate proximity to evil was to absorb something of that darkness in ways that no amount of professional training could fully prevent. The profilers who worked in the behavioural science unit at Quantico, and who continue to work in what is now called the behavioural analysis unit, exist in a peculiar psychological space, professionally committed to understanding the motivations and inner lives of people who have committed acts of extraordinary cruelty while simultaneously maintaining their own psychological stability and moral compass, and the rates of post-traumatic stress, burnout, substance abuse, and broken relationships within the unit, while not widely publicised, are known within law enforcement circles to be significant. There is something deeply paradoxical about this work, that the very qualities that make someone effective at it, empathy, imagination, emotional sensitivity, the ability to see the world through another person's eyes, are also the qualities that make one most vulnerable to its psychological consequences, and the profilers who have spoken publicly about their experiences describe a kind of occupational shadow, a a persistent awareness of the capacity for darkness that exists within the human mind, an awareness that does not fade with distance or time, but that becomes a permanent feature of how one sees the world. There are cases that haunt them individually, cases that were never solved, victims whose names they carry quietly through the years, the ones that got away not because of any failure of effort, but because the evidence was insufficient or the profile was wrong, or the lead simply dried up. And these unsolved cases represent a different kind of psychological burden than the solved ones, a burden of incompleteness that gnaws at the particular type of mind that is drawn to this work in the first place. The mind that cannot rest while a pattern remains unexplained and a perpetrator remains unnamed. And there is, among the most thoughtful practitioners of this discipline, a kind of intellectual honesty that is as rare as it is admirable, an acknowledgement that for every case in which criminal profiling provided the crucial insight that led to identification and arrest, there are other cases in which the profile was wrong or misleading or simply irrelevant, cases in which the crime was solved through traditional detective work or forensic science, or the simple luck of a traffic stop or a tip from a neighbour, and that the mythology that has grown up around criminal profiling, fueled by books and films and television series that dramatise the profiler as a kind of psychological Sherlock Holmes, capable of divining the identity of an unknown offender through sheer force of insight, bears only a partial resemblance to the messy and uncertain reality of the work. The truth about criminal profiling is that it is neither the infallible science its most enthusiastic proponents have sometimes claimed, nor the pseudo-scientific fraud its harshest critics have alleged, but something more human and more modest than either characterization allows, a discipline built on the accumulated observations of dedicated professionals who spent their careers studying the worst of human behavior, and who attempted, with varying degrees of success, to organize those observations into frameworks that could be useful to investigators in the field, frameworks that were always provisional, always subject to revision, always limited by the irreducible complexity of individual human psychology and the infinite variability of circumstance. What remains, when all the theories and techniques and technologies are set aside, is something that cannot be captured in a database or an algorithm, the simple and profound reality that understanding why human beings do terrible things to one another requires not just intelligence or training or experience, but a willingness to sit with darkness, to look at it steadily and without flinching, and to hold in one's mind simultaneously the horror of what has been done and the humanity of the person who did it, not to excuse or forgive, but to understand, because understanding is the only path to prevention, and because the alternative, to dismiss violent offenders as incomprehensible monsters, is to abdicate the very inquiry that might prevent future suffering. The people who choose this work, who spend their lives trying to map the contours of human darkness, do so knowing that the map will never be complete, that every case will present something new and unexpected, that the human capacity for violence is as creative and as varied as the human capacity for love, and that the best they can hope for is to illuminate small portions of a vast and shifting landscape, to make the unknown slightly more knowable, the unpredictable slightly more predictable, and to carry the weight of that knowledge with whatever grace they can manage. And so the work continues, in quiet offices and lecture halls and interrogation rooms and the private spaces of troubled dreams, one mind reaching toward another across the immense distance that separates ordinary experience from the incomprehensible, searching for the patterns that connect, the threads of cause and consequence that might, if followed carefully enough, lead to understanding, or at the very least to the kind of hard-won, imperfect knowledge that is the best that human beings have ever managed when confronting the deepest mysteries of their own nature.